"We're moving Nora out of the lab and into a consulting role," Walter Callahan said, not looking at me, as if I were an agenda item instead of a person sitting 3 feet away from him. "Effective the first of the month." Nobody at that boardroom table flinched. Not my husband, Preston, who kept his eyes on his phone. Not his sister, Blair, who was already smiling at her reflection in the polished glass wall behind her father's chair. Not Vivian, my mother-in-law, who sat at the head of the table like a queen presiding over a verdict she had written herself weeks ago. I had been the chief science officer of Callahan Biosciences for 11 years. I had built the diagnostic platform that put this company on the map, the one insiders called Velostat, the one that had turned a sleepy regional lab into a 9-figure business. I had done it while raising 2 children, while smiling through Thanksgiving dinners where Walter introduced me to his golf buddies as Preston's wife. She dabbles in the science side, while watching Blair get promoted twice for work I had quietly finished for her at midnight so the whole department wouldn't miss a deadline. And now, at 46 years old, in a boardroom I had helped pay for, I was being handed a title with the word consulting in it, which everyone in that building knew was corporate language for, "We are done with you. Please leave quietly." May I ask why? My voice came out steadier than I expected. I had learned, over 2 decades in this family, that steadiness was the only currency that ever bought me anything close to respect. Walter finally looked up. He had kind eyes when he wanted something from you, and flat, unreadable ones when he didn't. Today, they were flat. "The board feels the science division needs a fresher face moving into the Meridian negotiations. Blair has the client relationships. You understand." I did understand. I understood perfectly. Meridian Health Group had offered $2.4 billion to acquire Callahan Biosciences, and in 6 weeks, when that deal closed, everyone at this table was going to become wealthy beyond anything they had ever imagined. And somewhere in the last quarter, someone, probably Vivian, possibly Preston, likely both, had decided that a fresher face meant a face that hadn't spent a decade in a lab coat with chemical burns on her forearms. A face that photographed better in a press release. A face that wasn't, God forbid, 46. "I built Velostat," I said quietly. "I hold 11 patents connected to that platform. I'm not asking to keep my corner office out of vanity, Walter. I'm asking because I don't understand how you plan to close a deal on technology I designed while removing the person Meridian's own due diligence team has been requesting meetings with for the last 3 months." Blair let out a short laugh, the kind reserved for a child who has said something adorably naive. "Nora, sweetie, the patents are assigned to the company. That's how employment works. You didn't think you were going to walk out of here with your own algorithm under your arm, did you?" I didn't answer her. I looked at Preston instead. My husband of 19 years, the man I had married in a backyard in Vermont with fairy lights strung through the maple trees. The man who used to bring me coffee in the lab at 2 in the morning when I was chasing a compound that wouldn't behave. He was still looking at his phone. He hadn't said a single word since I walked into the room. "Preston," I said. He looked up then, and for one unguarded second I saw something that might have been shame flicker behind his eyes before it disappeared, replaced by the practiced neutrality he'd perfected since making partner track at his father's company. "It's a business decision, Nora. It's not personal. 11 years, 2 children, 19 years of marriage, and he could sit there and tell me it wasn't personal." "Fine," I said, and I stood up, smoothing my skirt, because if there was one thing my own mother had taught me, the one lesson from my childhood I had actually kept, it was that you never let them see your hands shake. "I'll clean out my office by Friday." "Monday is fine," Vivian said, as if she were doing me a favor. I walked out of that boardroom with my head high and my heart cracking quietly down the center, and nobody in that room noticed, because nobody in that room had ever really been looking at me. They had been looking at what I could produce for them. And now that they believed they had everything they needed from me, they assumed I was disposable. They were wrong. But it would take them 6 more weeks to find out exactly how wrong, and I intended to let every single one of those weeks pass in complete, deceptive calm. I want to back up, because you should understand how a woman ends up in a boardroom being erased from her own life's work by people who share her last name. I met Preston Callahan when I was 27 years old, finishing my postdoc in computational biology at a university in Boston, the kind of place where you survive on burnt coffee and the conviction that your research actually matters. Preston was doing an MBA 2 buildings over, charming in the specific way that men who have never once in their lives worried about money are charming, easy, generous, endlessly confident that things would work out, because for him, they always had. His family owned a diagnostics company his grandfather had started in a strip mall in the 1960s, running basic blood panels for local doctors. By the time I met Preston, Callahan Biosciences was a respectable mid-size operation, profitable but unremarkable. The kind of company that shows up in trade publications twice a year and nowhere else. Walter Callahan interviewed me himself, in a conference room that smelled like carpet cleaner, and I remember him asking me exactly one substantive question about my research before spending 20 minutes asking about my 5-year plan, in a tone that made it very clear he was really asking about children. I answered every question honestly and got the job anyway, because even then, in 2004, Walter Callahan understood that talent was worth swallowing his own discomfort for, as long as the talent kept its head down and didn't ask for too much credit. I did not keep my head down. I built things. Within 4 years, I had developed the core architecture for what would become Velostat, a diagnostic algorithm that could flag early-stage biomarkers for a dozen conditions from a single blood draw, faster and cheaper than anything on the market. It took me 6 more years to get it through clinical validation, 6 years of grant applications and regulatory meetings, and nights in the lab that Preston, by then my husband, filled by working late himself, by golfing with his father, by slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming a man who talked about our company's technology in meetings without ever once saying my name. I let it happen. I want to be honest about that, because the women watching this video who have lived some version of my story know exactly what I mean. I let it happen because I was tired, because I had 2 babies under 3, because fighting for credit felt like one more fight I didn't have the hours in the day to have, because Walter signed my paychecks and Vivian hosted my children's birthday parties, and it felt, most days, easier to be quietly essential than loudly acknowledged. There is a cost to that choice. I want to be honest about that too. The cost is that when the people around you decide you are no longer useful to their plans, they will not hesitate, because in their minds, you were never really a person with independent value in the first place. You were a very good employee who happened to also be family. And employees, when a $2.4 billion acquisition is on the table, are the first thing you cut to make the numbers look clean. What Walter Callahan did not know, what none of them knew, because I had never once mentioned it in 19 years of holiday dinners, was that in 2011, on the advice of a tax attorney I'd hired independently after my own father, in a rare moment of unsolicited fatherly wisdom, told me never to let a man's family hold all your paper, I had structured the core patents behind Velostat not as work-for-hire assigned wholesale to Callahan Biosciences, but as an exclusive licensing agreement between the company and a small intellectual property holding entity in my maiden name. Hale Diagnostics, LLC. A shell so quiet it had never once come up in a due diligence meeting, because nobody at Callahan Biosciences had ever thought to look for it. Why would they? I was just Preston's wife. I dabbled in the science side. The license Callahan Biosciences held to my patents was set to auto-renew every 5 years, silently, automatically, unless either party formally intervened 90 days before the renewal date. The next renewal date was 6 weeks and 2 days away. And as of that morning in the boardroom, I no longer had any intention of letting it auto-renew. I did not cry in the elevator. I did not cry in the parking garage. I did not cry until I was sitting in my car with the doors locked. And even then, I gave myself exactly 4 minutes, because I had learned a long time ago that grief is a luxury you ration when you are the only adult in a house who is actually paying attention. My daughter, Sophie, was 17 that year, a junior in high school, applying to colleges with the particular ferocity of a girl who had watched her mother work herself half to death and had quietly decided she was never going to depend on anyone the way she'd seen me depend on the Callahans. My son, Adam, was 20, home from college for the summer, working an unpaid internship at, of all places, a biotech incubator 2 towns over, telling anyone who would listen that he wanted to be just like Mom, but with better negotiating skills. I drove home that afternoon rehearsing what I would say to them, and by the time I pulled into the driveway of the house, Preston and I had bought 12 years earlier. A colonial with black shutters and a garden I had built myself, planting every hydrangea with my own hands because gardening was the one thing in my life that rewarded exactly the effort I put into it. I had decided on the truth. Not the raw, bleeding version, the dignified version. The version a mother gives her children when she wants them to learn something true about how the world works, without teaching them to be afraid of it. Grandpa Walter is restructuring the company, I told them over dinner. I'm stepping back from the lab. Sophie put her fork down. She has always been able to read a room the way I read chromatography results. Quickly, precisely, without sentiment getting in the way of the data. Stepping back or being pushed? Does it matter? It matters to me, she said. Because if Grandpa Walter thinks he can push you out of a company you basically invented, I want to know what he thinks he knows that we don't. I looked at my daughter and felt, not for the first time, that she understood the architecture of power in that family better at 17 than I had at 35. He thinks, I said slowly, that I am replaceable, that the work I did belongs to the company, and the company belongs to him, and therefore, in the end, the work belongs to him too. Is he right? I thought about Hale Diagnostics, LLC, sitting quietly in a filing cabinet in a lawyer's office 40 minutes from our house, a name none of them had heard in 14 years because I had made absolutely certain of it. No, I said, he's not right. He's just never had a reason to find out how wrong he is. Adam frowned. Mom, what does that mean? It means, I said, and I smiled at my children for what felt like the first genuine smile of that entire day, that your mother is going to spend the next 6 weeks being extremely, extremely patient. And I would like both of you to do the same. Can you do that for me? They exchanged a look, the kind siblings develop after 2 decades of translating their parents' half-sentences into full meaning between themselves, and Sophie said, Are we about to watch you take down an entire pharmaceutical company, or is this a metaphor? It's not a metaphor, I said, but it's not going to look like anything at all for a while. That's the point. That night, after the kids went to bed, Preston came home at 9:40, smelling faintly of a cologne that wasn't his usual one, and told me, without meeting my eyes, that he'd be sleeping in the guest room for a while to give us both some space to process the transition. I said, Of course, and I meant it as a diagnosis, not an agreement. The next morning, I called a woman named Renata Ibarra, the tax and intellectual property attorney who had drafted the Hale diagnostic structure back in 2011, and who had, over the years, become something closer to a friend than a professional contact. The kind of woman I had lunch with twice a year to talk about everything except the actual reason our relationship had started. "Nora Callahan," she said when she picked up, and I could hear the smile in her voice, the particular warmth of someone who has always suspected you were smarter than you let on and has been waiting patiently for you to prove it. "It's been a while. Tell me this isn't a social call." "They're pushing me out," I said. "Consulting title, effective the 1st. Blair's taking the science division into the Meridian negotiations." There was a pause on the line, the pause of a woman doing rapid math. "The Meridian acquisition is worth $2.4 billion, and it hinges entirely on Velostat." "Yes." "And the license renewal on the Hale Diagnostics patents is due when?" 90 days from 6 weeks and 2 days ago. So, roughly a month and a half." "Nora." Renata's voice had shifted into the register I recognized from the 2 times in our friendship I had watched her walk into a room and dismantle an opposing counsel's entire argument in under 10 minutes. "Do you understand what you're sitting on right now?" "I think I do," I said. "I want you to walk me through exactly what happens if I let that renewal lapse without formal notice, versus what happens if I send formal non-renewal now." We spent 90 minutes on the phone that morning, and by the end of it, I understood my position with a clarity that felt almost frightening, the way it feels when you've been squinting at a blurred image for years and someone finally hands you the right prescription glasses. If I sent formal notice of non-renewal now, 90 days before the auto-renewal date, Callahan Biosciences would have advance warning and time to either negotiate a new licensing deal with me directly or scramble to design around my patents before the acquisition closed. Painful for them, but survivable, if they moved fast and treated me with something resembling respect. If I did nothing, if I simply let the silence continue, let them finish their due diligence, let Meridian's lawyers comb through the deal room confident that all the necessary intellectual property was cleanly assigned to the company they were buying, the license would expire on its own, quietly, contractually, exactly 90 days after they had shut me out of the boardroom, and precisely 2 weeks before the acquisition's scheduled closing date. "That's not a coincidence you engineered," Renata said. "That's a coincidence your father-in-law engineered, the day he decided to fire you before checking what you actually owned." "I'm not looking to blow up a $2.4 billion deal out of spite," I told her. And I meant it, mostly. "I'm looking to make sure that when this is over, I'm not the only person in that family who ends up with nothing." "Then here's my advice," Renata said. "You do nothing. Legally, you are entitled to do absolutely nothing. Silence is not fraud. You have no fiduciary obligation to volunteer information to a company that just terminated your role and excluded you from a deal room built on your own patents. Let them ask you the right questions. If they never think to ask, that is not your failure, Nora. That is theirs." I sat with that advice for a long moment after we hung up, staring out my kitchen window at the hydrangeas I had planted with my own hands, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter and more durable than anger. Clarity. I was not going to scream. I was not going to threaten. I was not going to walk back into that boardroom and demand they see me. I was simply going to become very, very quiet and let the machine they had built without me run itself directly into the wall I had been standing next to, unnoticed, for 14 years. I cleared out my office on a Friday, exactly as instructed, and I did it alone, on a Sunday afternoon instead, so that no one from the science team would see me carrying 11 years of my life out in cardboard boxes and start asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. My office had a window that looked out over the loading dock, not the parking lot with the good view that Blair's office had, a detail I had stopped noticing as a slight sometime around year 6 because noticing things like that had started to feel like a hobby I no longer had the emotional budget for. I packed my books. I packed the photographs of Sophie and Adam at every age, taped to my monitor in a chronological collage that had made 3 different lab technicians tear up over the years when they realized how long I'd been building it. I packed the plaque from the FDA approval ceremony for Velostat, my name on it in letters half the size of Walter's, because Market Optics had required the company founder's name to appear first, even though Walter Callahan could not, to this day, correctly explain how a receiver-operator characteristic curve worked. I found, in the back of my bottom drawer, a folder I had almost forgotten about. Printed emails from 2015, the year I discovered, by accident, checking a shared expense account while covering for Vivian during her hip surgery recovery, that roughly $400,000 in consulting fees had been routed over 18 months to a company called Ridgeline Strategic Partners, an entity that, as far as I had ever been able to determine, consisted of one post office box in Delaware and Vivian's brother-in-law's golf partner. I had never done anything with that folder. At the time, confronting Vivian had felt like a fight that would cost me more than it won me. I had a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and a lab full of unfinished clinical trials, and Vivian was, whatever else she was, the woman who picked my children up from school 3 days a week without ever once complaining about it. I had filed the folder away under a private, unspoken agreement with myself. I would not use it unless I had to. Sitting on the floor of my empty office that Sunday afternoon, surrounded by boxes, I understood that, unless I had to, had just arrived. I did not confront anyone that day. I photographed every page of that folder on my phone, uploaded the images to 3 separate encrypted backups, put the physical folder back exactly where I'd found it, and carried my boxes out to my car in the golden, ordinary light of a Sunday evening, feeling, for the first time in 6 days, something that was almost peaceful. I texted Renata a single line that night. Found something else. Not using it yet. Just want you to know it exists. She wrote back within the minute. Good girl. Keep receipts. Say nothing. I drove home past the office building where I had spent 11 years of my life, its windows dark, the Callahan Biosciences sign lit up in blue against the evening sky, and I did not feel the urge to look back at it that I expected to feel. I felt instead, like a woman driving toward something, for the first time in a very long time, instead of away from it. The weeks that followed taught me more about my husband than the previous 19 years combined, mostly because I stopped filling in the blanks for him out of habit and started simply watching. Preston had always been a man who needed an audience for his own decency. He needed to be seen bringing me coffee, seen doing the school run, seen telling his golf buddies that his wife was the real genius in the family. Honestly, I just signed the checks. What I had never fully reckoned with, until I had the strange clarifying distance of no longer working in the same building as him, was how much of that decency evaporated the moment there was no one left to perform it for. He came home later. He took calls in the garage with the door shut. He started going to the gym at 6 in the morning, a gym he had never once mentioned in 19 years of marriage, and came back showered, which struck me, once I let myself actually think about it instead of politely declining to, as an unusual amount of effort for a cardio routine. I did not confront him. This is the part of the story that surprised even me, looking back. How much strength it took not to demand answers, and how much more strength it gave me, in the end, to wait for the answers to arrive on their own. They arrived on a Tuesday in the form of a text message that buzzed on Preston's phone while it was charging on the kitchen counter, and I happened to be standing 3 feet away, refilling my coffee, not looking for anything, not needing to look for anything, because the universe has a way of handing tired women exactly the evidence they've been too dignified to go hunting for. Miss you already. Can't wait for Thursday. Wear the blue one. The name attached to the message was Ashley Kirkpatrick. 29 years old, Blair's executive assistant, a young woman I had personally trained on the deal room data protocols 8 months earlier, back when I still had a security badge that let me into that part of the building. I did not throw the phone across the room. I did not scream. I photographed the message, the way Renata had taught me to photograph everything now, and I put the phone back exactly where it had been, screen down, charging, innocent. Then I went upstairs, sat down on the edge of my bed in the room I had shared with Preston for 12 years, and let myself cry. Really cry, the kind of crying I hadn't allowed myself since the boardroom, for exactly the 11 minutes it took me to feel the worst of it move through me. And then I washed my face, and went back downstairs, and made dinner for my children, because grief, I had learned a long time ago, does not excuse you from dinner. I told Sophie and Adam almost nothing that spring, not because I didn't trust them, but because I understood something about protecting your children that I don't think either of them will fully understand until they have children of their own. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for the people you love is carry the weight yourself for as long as you possibly can, so that when the truth finally does land on them, it lands as history, instead of as an open wound. What I told Renata, on the other hand, I told in full. He's having an affair with Blair's assistant, I said, sitting in Renata's office on a rainy Thursday, the same Thursday, I would later learn, that Preston had told his mother he was working late on the Meridian data room. Renata did not look surprised. Renata, I had come to understand over the years, was rarely surprised by anything men in positions of unearned confidence did when they believed no one was watching closely enough to catch them. Do you want a divorce attorney, or do you want to handle the marriage separately from the business? Both, I said. But not yet. Not until the licensing situation resolves. I don't want Preston or Vivian or Walter to have a single reason to suspect that anything in my life is moving until I choose for them to know it. That's a cold, disciplined strategy, Renata said, and there was something like admiration in her voice. I learned discipline from a family that only ever rewarded me for being useful, I said. I'd like to see what happens when I finally spend some of it on myself. We spent that meeting mapping out a timeline. The Meridian acquisition was scheduled to close in 8 weeks. The Hale Diagnostics licensing renewal would lapse, silently, contractually, in 6. Renata had already quietly reached out, through a channel that would never trace back to me, to a friend on Meridian's own outside counsel, not to share confidential information, which would have been both unethical and legally catastrophic, but simply to confirm a single fact. That Meridian's due diligence team had, as of that week, flagged the Velostat patent chain as fully assigned, no outstanding third-party licensing dependencies, based entirely on documentation Callahan Biosciences itself had provided. They had told Meridian, in writing, that they owned something they did not own. When this comes out, Renata said carefully, and it will come out, Nora, because deals this size do not fall apart quietly. The exposure isn't just financial for the Callahans, it's a potential fraud claim from Meridian, if it can be shown Walter's team knew or should have known about the licensing structure and represented otherwise. I never lied to Meridian, I said. I've never spoken to a single person on their deal team. No, Renata agreed. You didn't lie to anyone. You just let a man who fired you before checking his own paperwork tell some very expensive lawyers something that wasn't true. My own family, I should tell you, was no refuge during those weeks, though for entirely different reasons than the Callahans. I grew up the older of 2 children in a modest house outside Hartford, the daughter of a father who ran a hardware store, and a mother who had, I understand now with the compassion that only comes decades later, wanted a different kind of life than the one she got, and had spent my entire childhood quietly, unconsciously punishing me for reminding her of the ambitions she'd set aside. My younger brother, Danny, was the golden child in our house the way Blair was the golden child at Callahan Biosciences, not because he had done anything in particular to earn it, but because he had been born into the role and no one in our family had ever seriously questioned the casting. When I got my PhD, my father framed my diploma and hung it in the hardware store, next to a photo of Danny's high school baseball team, a team he had played on for one unremarkable season before quitting to work at the store full-time. When Danny got married, my mother spent 11 months planning the wedding. When I got married, she spent 3 weekends helping me find a caterer, and spent most of that time telling me how lucky I was that a family like the Callahans wanted anything to do with me. I called my mother that spring, during the worst of it, the way you sometimes reach for the person who raised you even when you know, with total certainty, that they will not give you what you actually need. Preston's mother is difficult, I know, my mother said, after I told her, in the careful, edited version I'd also given my children, that things at the company were complicated right now. But Nora, you have a good life, a beautiful house, wonderful children. You need to be careful you don't let your pride get in the way of a good thing. My pride, I repeated. You've always needed to be the smartest person in the room, my mother said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. Sometimes it's enough to just be grateful for what you have. I did not argue with her. I had learned, across 4 decades, that arguing with my mother about the shape of my own ambition was like arguing with a river about which way it should flow. Technically possible to attempt, entirely pointless as an exercise. I told her I loved her, and I hung up, and I sat in my car in the grocery store parking lot for a while, feeling the particular loneliness of a woman who has just realized that the family she was born into and the family she married into have, in their own very different ways, arrived at exactly the same verdict about her worth. And then I drove home and unpacked the groceries and made dinner and started quietly, in the evenings after my children went to bed, drafting the founding documents for a company of my own. I want to tell you about the night I decided to build Hale Diagnostics into something real, because I think it's the part of this story that matters most, more than the reckoning that was coming for the Callahans, more than the divorce papers I would eventually file. It was a Tuesday in late spring, 11 o'clock at night, and I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open to a blank document, the cursor blinking on a line where I'd typed business plan, draft, and nothing else for the better part of 20 minutes, when Sophie came downstairs for a glass of water and found me there. "You're doing the thing again?" she said. "The thing where you stare at a screen like it owes you money." "I'm trying to figure out if I'm actually capable of building something on my own," I told her, because I had decided, somewhere in the last few weeks, that I owed my daughter honesty even when the honest answer was uncertain. I spent 11 years building someone else's company. I don't actually know if I know how to build my own. Sophie sat down across from me, pulled the laptop toward herself, and read the 2 words on the screen. Then she looked up at me with an expression I recognized, because it was the same expression I used to wear in the lab, right before a breakthrough. The look of someone who has just seen the shape of an answer forming out of noise. "Mom," she said, "you invented Velostat in a rented lab space with a team of 4 people and a grant. You had to reapply for every 18 months, while pregnant with Adam, while Dad was building his career at his father's company doing, from what I can tell, mostly golf. You didn't build Callahan Biosciences' success. You built Velostat. Callahan Biosciences just had the good luck to employ you." I laughed. A real laugh. The first one in weeks. "When did you get so smart?" "I had an excellent teacher," Sophie said. "She just forgot, for a while, that she was allowed to use any of it for herself. We stayed up until nearly 2 that morning, my 17-year-old daughter and I, sketching out the outline of a company on a legal pad because the laptop felt too formal for what we were actually doing, which was closer to dreaming than planning. Hale Diagnostics would not simply hold patents and collect licensing fees. That had been its quiet, dormant purpose for 14 years. It would become an actual operating company, a next-generation diagnostics lab, built around not just Velostat but the 3 newer compounds I had been developing in my own time for the past 2 years. Compounds Callahan Biosciences had shown no interest in funding because Walter considered anything beyond the current product line an unnecessary distraction from the Meridian conversation. Compounds that, because I had developed them entirely outside company hours, using my own equipment, funded by my own money, belonged to no one but me. By the time Sophie finally went to bed, I had the beginning of something I hadn't had in longer than I could remember. Not a plan for revenge, though the reckoning was still coming, but a plan for a life. My own name on the door, my own decisions. My own version of the company I had spent 14 years quietly, invisibly building for other people. I called Renata the next morning before I'd even finished my coffee. I want to talk about incorporating Hale Diagnostics as an operating entity, I told her. Not just a licensing shell, a real company. Now you're talking, Renata said, and I could hear her smiling. Welcome to the other side of this thing, Nora. The weeks moved differently for me after that night with Sophie. Faster in some ways, slower in others. The way time behaves when you finally have something of your own to move toward instead of only something to survive. By day, I kept my consulting arrangement with Callahan Biosciences exactly as agreed. Technically compliant, quietly minimal, answering emails within the letter of my contract, and never a syllable beyond it. Blair, now nominally running the science division despite having, as far as I could tell, never once run a Western blot in her life, called me twice with questions about the Velostat validation data that she clearly did not understand well enough to ask correctly. And I answered both calls with the calm, professional patience of a woman who had decided that being underestimated was, for the next several weeks, the most useful disguise available to her. I just want to make sure the Meridian data room has everything it needs, Blair said during the second call, and there was an edge of genuine anxiety in her voice that told me she understood. On some instinctive level, she hadn't yet articulated even to herself that she was standing on ground she had never actually surveyed. I'm sure it's fine, I told her. The documentation has always been thorough. It had been thorough. It had also, as Renata and I both knew by then, been thoroughly, catastrophically wrong about who actually owned the intellectual property at the center of the entire deal. By night, I built. I found a small commercial space 11 miles from the house, a converted warehouse that had briefly been a craft brewery before the owners defaulted, with good bones and terrible plumbing, and I signed a 6-month lease using savings I had quietly, deliberately kept in an account under my own name for exactly this kind of contingency. Another piece of advice from my father, given once, decades earlier, that I had never fully appreciated until now. I reached out to 2 former postdocs from my own lab, both of whom had left Callahan Biosciences within the last 2 years for reasons that, I was unsurprised to learn, involved feeling chronically undervalued and quietly credited over by people less capable than themselves. You want us to come build a diagnostics company with you, said Priya Anand, the first one I called, a brilliant, restless chemist I'd mentored for 6 years before she'd left in frustration 18 months earlier. In a warehouse. That used to be a brewery. I want you to come build a diagnostics company with me, I confirmed, in a warehouse. That used to be a brewery, where you will have equity, your name on every patent you contribute to, and a boss who will never once introduce you to anyone as someone who dabbles in science. There was a long pause on the line. When do I start? Adam came home from his internship one weekend in early June, tanned and animated in the particular way 20-year-olds get when they've just discovered a professional world that finally makes sense to them, and found me in the garage, unpacking boxes of secondhand lab equipment I'd bought at auction from a defunct biotech startup 2 states over. "Mom," he said slowly, taking in the centrifuge, the 2 refrigerated units, the stack of unopened boxes marked fragile, lab glassware. "Is this what I think it is?" "It's what you think it is," I confirmed. He sat down on an overturned crate and watched me work for a while, in the comfortable, easy silence we'd always had together, the kind of silence that had made him, since he was small, the child I found it easiest to simply exist alongside. "Does Dad know?" "No," I said. "And I'd like to keep it that way for a little while longer. Can you do that for me?" "Mom, I need you to understand something," Adam said, and there was an unfamiliar seriousness in his voice, a seriousness I recognized, with a small ache, as the particular gravity of a child realizing his parents are not simply his parents, but also complicated, flawed, capable adults living lives he does not fully have access to. "I've been at that internship for 10 weeks. I've sat in meetings where people talk about Velostat like it's this legendary thing, this platform that changed the whole field. And every single time, they talk about it like it's Grandpa Walter's company, Grandpa Walter's vision. Nobody ever mentions you. I used to think that was just, I don't know, how business worked, credit rolls uphill. But I don't think that anymore." "What do you think now?" "I think," Adam said carefully, "that you let them take credit for your work for a really long time, because you thought that was the price of keeping the peace. And I think Grandpa just fired you anyway, so I'm not sure what the peace actually bought you." I set down the box I was holding and looked at my son, 20 years old, sitting on an overturned crate in a garage full of secondhand lab equipment, and felt something that was equal parts grief and pride. "It bought me you and your sister growing up in a stable home," I said. "It bought me 11 years of doing work I loved, even if other people got the credit for it. I don't regret the choice, Adam. I regret how long I let it go on after it stopped serving anyone but them." "So what happens now?" "Now," I said, "your mother builds something with her own name on it. And if you want to spend the rest of the summer helping me instead of filing paperwork for people who've never once asked you an interesting question, I would love to have you." Adam grinned, the first real, unguarded grin I'd seen from him in weeks. "I quit that internship Friday, actually. I had a feeling something better was coming. Vivian Callahan called me on a Sunday afternoon in mid-June, exactly 4 weeks before the Meridian deal was scheduled to close, and exactly 2 weeks before the Hale Diagnostics licensing renewal was set to quietly, contractually lapse, though of course Vivian had no idea that Second Date existed at all. "Nora, darling," she said, in the particular register she used when she wanted something and had decided charm would get it faster than demands, "I hope you're settling well into your consulting role." "I'm settling fine, Vivian. I wanted to check in, mother to daughter, so to speak, about you and Preston. He mentioned things have been strained." I nearly laughed. Preston, who had been having an affair with his sister's 29-year-old assistant for at least 3 months, who had been sleeping in the guest room for 6 weeks, who had told his own mother that things were merely strained, as if we were disagreeing about paint colors. "Things are what they are," I said carefully. "I do hope you'll consider the family's position as this deal moves forward," Vivian continued. "It would be enormously stressful for everyone if personal matters were to complicate a $2.4 billion transaction. I know you understand the importance of keeping business and personal separate, Nora. You always have. It's one of the things Walter has always admired about you." There it was, the actual purpose of the call, wrapped in enough soft language that Vivian could later claim, if it ever came to it, that she had said nothing untoward. She was asking me, in the only language she had ever known how to use with me, not to make trouble. She was asking a woman she had just watched her husband fire without a severance conversation, without an acknowledgement of 11 years of work, without so much as a card, to please continue behaving conveniently for the next 4 weeks, so that everyone else's payday could proceed unbothered. I understand completely, I told her, and I meant it in a way she would not understand the true shape of for 2 more weeks. I have no intention of complicating anything, Vivian. I plan to be very, very quiet. Wonderful, Vivian said, relief audible even through the phone. Walter will be so pleased to hear it. You know how fond he is of you, really, underneath it all. I thought of the folder in my bottom drawer, the one I had left exactly where I'd found it. The $400,000 routed to a post office box in Delaware. I thought of 11 patents. I thought of the license quietly counting down, unnoticed by anyone but me and one very good attorney. I know how fond he is of me, I said. Give my best to Walter. The 4th of July fell 9 days before the licensing deadline that year, and Vivian, in what I can only describe as a masterpiece of oblivious timing, decided to host the annual Callahan family barbecue at the lake house, the same lake house where, 3 summers earlier, Walter had given a toast at my 43rd birthday about how this family wouldn't be where it is without the people who work quietly behind the scenes. A line I had, at the time, taken as a compliment. I almost didn't go. Renata, when I called her to talk through the decision, was characteristically direct. Going shows them nothing has changed, not going tips them off that something has. Go. Smile. Eat the potato salad. You have 9 days left, Nora. Don't blink now. So I went. In a yellow sundress, Sophie helped me pick out specifically because, she said, you should look happy, Mom, even if it makes their skin crawl a little. And I stood by the lake with a glass of white wine I barely touched, and I watched my husband's family perform the particular choreography of people who believe their fortunes are about to multiply and cannot quite contain their excitement about it. Blair cornered me near the dessert table, flushed with either champagne or genuine anxiety, hard to tell which. Nora, can I ask you something? Off the record? Of course. The Meridian lawyers keep asking about something called an IP holding structure in one of the older financing documents from 2011. Walter says it's nothing, just an old tax thing, but I can't find anyone who actually understands what it was for. You were here in 2011. Do you remember anything about it? I looked at my sister-in-law, 31 years old, standing in the golden evening light of a party celebrating money that was not yet hers, asking the one question that could have saved her entire family 4 weeks earlier if anyone had thought to ask it with real curiosity instead of dismissive confidence. I remember there was a restructuring around then, I said, which was true, and told her nothing at all, which was also true. You'd have to ask Renata Ibarra. She handled a lot of the legal work from that period. Right, of course, Blair said, visibly relieved to have a name to hand off to someone else, the same instinct that had defined her entire career. I'll have someone follow up with her. Nobody ever did. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is, in many ways, the entire moral of this story. I told Blair Callahan, standing 3 feet from the answer that would have saved her family a catastrophic amount of money and public humiliation, exactly where to look. She had the name. She had 4 weeks. And she was so certain, so bone-deep certain, that whatever the issue was, it could not possibly be serious, could not possibly involve her sister-in-law's forgotten paperwork from a marriage that had always seemed, to the entire family, like the least interesting part of Nora's resume that she simply never followed up. I drove home from the lake house that night with the windows down, the wind pulling at my hair, and I felt something I had not expected to feel, Not triumph. Not yet. But a strange, settled kind of sorrow, the particular grief of watching people you have loved for 2 decades walk, with their eyes wide open and their ears closed, directly toward a cliff you had tried, in your own quiet way, to point out to them. The license lapsed on a Wednesday. I did not do anything on that day. That was the entire point, the strange, disciplined center of the whole strategy Renata and I had built together over the previous 8 weeks. I did nothing. I did not send a notice. I did not make a call. I did not walk into Walter Callahan's office and announce, with the flourish of a woman in a movie, that the clock had run out. I simply woke up that Wednesday morning, made coffee, drove Sophie to her SAT prep class, and spent the afternoon at the warehouse with Priya and my second hire, a soft-spoken bioinformatics specialist named Marcus Webb, calibrating a second-hand mass spectrometer we'd gotten for a fraction of its retail price because the seller hadn't known what he had. The silence, as Renata had promised me, was the entire mechanism. Contracts do not require drama to execute. They simply require time to pass, and I had spent 8 weeks making absolutely certain that time would pass exactly the way the original agreement specified, undisturbed by any action on my part. It took Callahan Biosciences 11 days to notice. I know this because Renata called me on a Sunday evening, her voice carrying an energy I had never heard from her before. Something between professional satisfaction and genuine delight. Meridian's outside counsel just flagged it, she said. Standard pre-closing IP verification sweep, the kind every acquirer runs in the final 2 weeks before wiring money. Their systems check found an active licensing dependency on the core Velostat patents that had lapsed 11 days ago and was never renewed. What happens now? Now, Renata said. Meridian's lawyers call Callahan Biosciences lawyers and ask a very simple, very devastating question. Who is Hale Diagnostics, LLC, and why does it appear to hold controlling rights to the single most valuable asset in this entire acquisition? I sat down on my kitchen floor, my back against the cabinets, and let myself feel, for the first time in weeks, the full weight of what was about to happen. Not fear. Something closer to vertigo, the sensation of standing at the top of a very tall building you built yourself and finally, looking down. Nora, Renata said gently. Are you there? I'm here, I said. I just need a minute. 11 years, Renata. I gave that place 11 years. I know, she said, and in about 72 hours they are going to understand, for the first time in 11 years, exactly what those years were worth. Walter Callahan called me himself on Monday morning, which told me, before he said a single word, exactly how frightened he was, because Walter Callahan had not personally dialed my phone number in at least 3 years. He had assistants for that. He had Preston for that. The fact that he was calling directly meant he had already run through every intermediary he trusted and found none of them adequate to the crisis. Nora. His voice was carefully controlled, the voice of a man rationing his own panic. There seems to be some confusion about a licensing entity called Hale Diagnostics. Our legal team can't locate anyone with that name in the corporate records. That's because it's not a Callahan Biosciences entity, Walter, I said, and I kept my own voice light, almost pleasant, because I had promised myself in the 8 weeks of waiting that when this moment finally came, I would not give them the satisfaction of hearing me angry. Anger, I had come to understand, is a gift you give the people who hurt you. It lets them recast themselves as victims of your reaction instead of authors of the situation that produced it. It's mine. It has always been mine. Renata Ibarra set it up in 2011, at my request, when the core Velostat patents were assigned by license rather than outright transfer. There was a silence on the line so long I genuinely wondered if the call had dropped. That's not possible, Walter said finally. Those patents belong to the company. You signed employment agreements. I signed employment agreements that assigned Callahan Biosciences an exclusive license to develop and commercialize patents held by Hale Diagnostics. I said. I never signed anything that transferred ownership. Your legal team should have that documentation. It's been part of the company's official records for 14 years. Nobody flagged this, Walter said, and I could hear, underneath the panic, the beginning of something I recognized with an almost clinical detachment. The specific fury of a man realizing that a woman he had never taken seriously had, for over a decade, held more power in her hands than he did, and had simply chosen, until this exact moment, not to use it. Nobody asked me, I said simply. I was in that boardroom 8 weeks ago, Walter, and I told you and Blair and Preston directly that I held 11 patents connected to this platform. Blair told me the patents belonged to the company. Nobody followed up. Nobody asked me a single question about the structure. I answered honestly, at every step, everything I was actually asked. I simply wasn't asked the right question. The license lapsed, Walter said, his voice flat now, the panic giving way, briefly to a kind of stunned arithmetic. It just lapsed. It auto-renews every 5 years unless someone intervenes 90 days beforehand, I said. Nobody intervened. I certainly didn't. I had no reason to renew a license I never agreed to grant in the first place, to a company that fired me 8 weeks ago and excluded me from every conversation about its future. Nora, the deal closes in 3 weeks, $2.4 billion. Do you understand what you're doing to this family? And there it was, the question I had been waiting 8 weeks to hear. The question that told me, with total finality, that Walter Callahan still did not understand, even now, even in the exact moment his entire empire was cracking open in front of him, that this had never been something I was doing to his family. This was something his family had done to itself. Over 14 years of quiet dismissal, and I had simply, finally, stopped absorbing the cost of it on their behalf. I understand exactly what I'm doing, Walter, I said. I'm protecting an asset that belongs to me. I'd encourage your legal team to review the original 2011 documentation carefully. I believe you'll find everything is exactly as it should be. I hung up the phone and I sat very still in my kitchen for a long time, and then I called Renata, and we both, for the first time in 8 weeks, allowed ourselves to laugh. The next 72 hours moved fast, the way things do once a foundation gives way, not gradually, but all at once, in a rush that leaves everyone standing in the dust of what used to be solid ground. Meridian's lawyers, once they understood the actual structure of the license, did not simply pause the deal. They pulled it entirely, citing a material misrepresentation in the company's disclosure of its own intellectual property portfolio. A misrepresentation that, whether or not anyone at Callahan Biosciences had known it was false, had nonetheless been made, in writing, to a $2.4 billion acquirer. Meridian's statement, when it eventually leaked to a trade publication 2 days later, was clinical and devastating in equal measure. Meridian Health Group has terminated its proposed acquisition of Callahan Biosciences following the discovery of unresolved third-party intellectual property claims that were not disclosed during the due diligence process. I read that sentence 4 times, sitting at my kitchen table, and felt the strange, quiet gravity of watching a story you had lived through become suddenly a matter of public record. Preston called me 11 times that week. I answered the third call, mostly because Renata advised me it would look worse, strategically, if it seemed like I was hiding. Nora, please, he said, and his voice had a rawness to it I hadn't heard since our children were born, the particular sound of a man who has finally run out of every other strategy. You have to fix this. My father is talking about how this could bankrupt the company. Blair's engagement to Todd. His family is a major investor, and now they're threatening to pull out entirely because of the scandal. This is everyone's life you're affecting, not just theirs. Preston, I said, and my voice, to my own surprise, was steady and almost gentle. You sat in a boardroom 8 weeks ago and watched your father fire me from a company I built, and you said nothing. You have been sleeping with your sister's assistant for at least 3 months. You did not fix either of those things when you had the chance. I am not going to fix this one for you. There was a long silence. You knew, he said finally, about Ashley. I've known for 6 weeks, I said. I filed for divorce this morning, Preston. You'll be served this week. I'd suggest you focus your energy there because I promise you, the company situation is the least complicated part of what's coming for you. I hung up before he could respond, and I sat in my kitchen, in the house with the black shutters and the hydrangeas I had planted with my own hands, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt instead something quieter and truer, the specific relief of a woman who has finally stopped carrying weight that was never hers to carry alone. The public fallout, once it started, moved with a speed and a cruelty that surprised even me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. I had, after all, spent 19 years watching this family perform certainty for outside audiences, and I understood, better than almost anyone, how quickly that performance could curdle into spectacle once the audience smelled blood. A financial journalist named Priscilla Woodard, who covered biotech acquisitions for a well-regarded industry publication, was the first to piece together the actual story, and she did it with a thoroughness that told me she had, at some point in her research, spoken to someone inside Meridian's legal team who was more than happy to explain, off the record, exactly why the deal had collapsed. Her article ran under the headline, "The Scientist They Forgot to Ask," and it laid out, in careful, unemotional prose, the story of a company that had spent 14 years building its most valuable asset on the uncredited work of a woman it had ultimately fired without bothering to check what she actually owned. I did not speak to Priscilla Woodard for that first article. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I did not orchestrate the press coverage. I did not leak documents. I answered, when she eventually reached me through Renata's office, a total of 6 factual questions, on the record, in a single 15-minute phone call, and declined to characterize anyone's motives or comment on my personal life. The rest of the story, the parts about Blair's canceled engagement, about Vivian's tearful appearance at a country club luncheon where she reportedly told friends she simply couldn't understand how a family member could do this, about Walter's abrupt, unexplained absence from a scheduled industry conference the following week. All of that came from other sources, sources I never spoke to, sources whose motives I have no particular insight into, except to say that I have found, across a lifetime of watching powerful people believe themselves untouchable, that a family which spends decades treating everyone around it as expendable rarely discovers, in its moment of crisis, that anyone is left who feels obligated to protect it. Sophie showed me the article on her phone, sitting at our kitchen table on a Saturday morning, and read the headline aloud with an expression I can only describe as fierce, protective pride. "The Scientist They Forgot to Ask," she repeated. "Mom, that's you. That's your headline." "It's not a headline I asked for," I said. Though I would be lying if I said reading it hadn't done something to loosen a knot in my chest that had been tightening, slowly, for 14 years. "Maybe not," Sophie said. "But it's true. And I think you've spent so long not wanting to make a fuss about things being true that you forgot what it feels like when the truth finally just arrives, on its own, without you having to fight for it." I thought about that for a long time after she went upstairs. My daughter, 17 years old, had understood something about my own life that had taken me until 46 to fully articulate. That dignity is not the same thing as silence, and that the years I had spent staying quiet to keep the peace had not, in the end, protected anyone but the people who benefited from my silence. Blair called me 3 weeks after the article ran, on an evening when I was at the warehouse with Priya and Marcus, running late-stage validation on the first of the 3 new compounds, the ones Callahan Biosciences had never wanted to fund. I almost didn't pick up. I picked up anyway, mostly out of a curiosity I couldn't quite suppress. "I need to ask you something," Blair said, and her voice had none of the airy confidence I'd known for 19 years. It sounded, for the first time in my experience of her, genuinely young. "Todd's family pulled the wedding. My engagement is over. Dad's talking about selling the lake house to cover the legal fees from the Meridian breach of warranty claim. And I keep asking myself how none of us saw this coming, and I keep landing on the same answer, which is that I asked you, directly, at the 4th of July party, whether you knew anything about that old IP structure, and you told me to talk to Renata Ibarra, and I never did. Did you want me to follow up? Were you trying to warn me?" I stood in the warehouse, surrounded by equipment I had bought with my own money, built by my own hands, and I thought carefully about how to answer my sister-in-law, a woman who had spent a decade being handed credit for work she hadn't done, and was now, for the first time, being handed the full weight of a consequence she also hadn't personally engineered, but had certainly benefited from without question. "I answered every question you asked me honestly, Blair," I said. "I told you exactly where to look. You had 4 weeks and a name. I wasn't going to chase you down and force you to understand something you weren't curious enough to investigate yourself. That's not warning someone. That's just answering the truth when it's asked of you." "That feels like a very careful way of saying you let it happen," Blair said, and there was no accusation in her voice, only a kind of exhausted, dawning recognition. "I let it happen the way gravity happens, Blair," I said. "I didn't build the cliff. Your family built the cliff, one dismissal at a time, over 14 years. I just stopped standing in front of it, warning everyone not to walk toward the edge, because nobody in that family had ever once, in 14 years, stopped to ask whether the woman doing the warning might actually know what she was talking about." Blair was quiet for a long moment. "For what it's worth," she said finally, "I'm sorry. I don't think I understood, until this happened, how much of what I got credit for was actually yours. I think I told myself a story where I'd earned things, because it was easier than looking too closely at where they actually came from. It was, I think, the most honest sentence anyone in that family had ever said to me. "Thank you for saying that," I told her, and I meant it. "I hope you build something of your own, Blair. I really do. It's a better feeling than you'd expect." Vivian never called to apologize. I want to be honest about that too, because this is not a story where every wound gets neatly stitched closed by the final chapter, and I think the women watching this, the ones who have lived some version of what I lived, deserve a story that tells the truth about that. Some people do not change because a consequence finally arrives at their door. Some people simply recalibrate their strategy for how to survive the consequence without ever once examining what they did to deserve it. I heard secondhand, through Adam, who had stayed close with his cousins even as the rest of the family fractured around him, that Vivian had told several people at that country club luncheon that I had always been calculating, that I had clearly been planning this for years, that the timing of my scheme, her word, coinciding so precisely with the Meridian deal, proved I had orchestrated the entire collapse out of spite for being pushed aside. I let myself feel angry about that for exactly one evening. Then I called Renata, mostly because I needed to hear a version of events grounded in something other than my own spiraling thoughts. And she said something that I have carried with me ever since. Nora, listen to me. You did not scheme anything. You held a legal right that existed for 14 years, and you simply declined to volunteer information to people who had already decided, before you ever opened your mouth, that your knowledge wasn't worth asking about. The only thing you're guilty of is being patient enough to let the truth arrive on a timeline that was, admittedly, extremely inconvenient for the people who wronged you. That's not a scheme. That's just what happens when you finally stop rescuing people from the consequences of their own arrogance. I thought about the Ridgeline Strategic Partners folder, still sitting untouched in that bottom drawer, and I made a decision that surprised even me. I was not going to use it. Not because I had softened toward Vivian. I hadn't. Not really. Not fully. But because I had understood, somewhere in the last few months, that the version of justice I actually wanted was not the version where I burned down every remaining piece of that family's life. It was the version where I simply, finally, got to walk away with what was mine and build something true and let the rest of it, the embezzlement, the cruelty, the 14 years of quiet dismissal, become their problem to reckon with, in their own time, on their own terms, without my continued participation in the reckoning. I sent the folder, anonymously, to Callahan Biosciences' outside auditors, through a channel Renata assured me could never be traced back to either of us, and then I let it go. Whatever happened to Vivian after that was between Vivian and the consequences of choices she had made entirely without my involvement, years before I had ever found that folder in the first place. The divorce settlement was finalized in October, 4 months after the boardroom meeting that had started all of it, and it was, by any objective measure, generous to me. Not because Preston had suddenly developed a conscience, but because his own attorneys had advised him, in no uncertain terms, that contesting a settlement with a woman whose intellectual property had just cost his family a $2.4 billion acquisition was not a fight he was likely to win in front of any judge, in any courtroom, in the entire state. I kept the house. Preston moved into a condominium closer to the office, the same office where, I later learned, Ashley Kirkpatrick had also quietly been let go. Not out of any belated sense of justice, but because Blair, in the wreckage of her own cancelled engagement and collapsed career, had apparently decided she no longer had the patience to watch her brother's affair play out in the cubicle next to her own. Sophie got into 3 of her top 4 college choices, including the one with the excellent chemistry program she'd had her eye on since sophomore year. And when the acceptance letter arrived, she read it out loud at our kitchen table with tears in her eyes and said, "I want to study what you do, Mom. Not because Grandpa Walter's name is on a plaque somewhere, because you built something real, even when nobody was watching, and I want to learn how to do that too." Adam, who had officially quit his internship the same week he'd found me unpacking secondhand lab equipment in our garage, became Hale Diagnostics' first operations hire, a role he approached with a seriousness and competence that reminded me, more than I let myself admit out loud very often, of the version of Preston I had fallen in love with 2 decades earlier, before ambition had curdled into entitlement. By the following spring, Hale Diagnostics had 12 employees, a modest but growing client base of independent clinics who valued a diagnostics partner that treated them like people instead of revenue targets, and a first-round investment from a venture fund whose managing partner, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Denise Okonkwo Bright, told me during our first meeting that she had read Priscilla Woodard's article 3 times before reaching out. "I don't invest in scandals," Denise said. "I invest in people who spent 14 years proving they could build something extraordinary and then had the discipline to wait for the right moment to prove it belonged to them. That's not a scandal, Nora. That's the best founder story I've heard in a decade." I did not tell her, in that meeting, about the nights I had spent crying on the edge of my bed, or the years of quiet dismissal that had come before, or the particular loneliness of being a woman whose worth had always been measured, by nearly everyone around her, in terms of usefulness rather than personhood. Some parts of the story, I had come to understand, were mine to keep, not because I was ashamed of them, but because they belonged to me in a way that no headline, no acquisition, no boardroom verdict would ever be entitled to. I want to tell you about my mother, because I think this part of the story matters as much as anything that happened in that boardroom, even though it unfolded far more quietly, in the kind of small, unglamorous moments that never make it into industry articles. She called me in November, 7 months after the boardroom meeting, 5 months after the Meridian deal collapsed, 1 month after the divorce was finalized. I almost didn't recognize her voice at first, because it carried none of the careful, faintly disapproving tone I had grown used to over 4 decades of conversations that always seemed to circle back, eventually, to some version of the question, why can't you just be satisfied with what you have? I read the article, she said, without preamble. The one in the trade magazine. Danny sent it to me. He said, Mom, did you know Nora built a $2 billion diagnostic platform? And I realized I didn't know that, Nora. Not really. I knew you worked in a lab. I knew you'd married well. I don't think I ever actually understood what you'd done. I don't think I ever told you, I admitted. It felt easier not to, most years. It felt like something you'd find a way to make smaller. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I wondered if I'd finally said something too honest for either of us to recover from. When my mother spoke again, her voice was different. Smaller, but also, somehow, more solid than I had ever heard it. I think I did that to you, she said. I think I spent your whole childhood making you smaller because your ambition frightened me. I gave up things, Nora, when I was young. A scholarship, a program in New York, I never told anyone about because your father proposed the same spring, and it felt easier to just let it go. And I think, watching you refuse to let anything go, all these years, made me feel like I'd made the wrong choice, and it was easier to tell myself you'd learn to be satisfied eventually than to admit I might have been the one who got it wrong. I sat with that confession for a long moment, feeling the particular vertigo of finally understanding, at 46 years old, the shape of a wound I had carried since childhood, without ever once being able to name its source. Mom, I said finally, I wish you'd told me that 20 years ago. I wish I had too, she said. I'm telling you now. I know that's not the same thing, but I'd like to try, if you'll let me, to be a different kind of mother to you from here forward, even this late. I'd like to come see the warehouse. Danny showed me pictures. It looks like exactly the kind of place you always deserve to have. I invited her the following weekend, and when she walked through the door of Hale Diagnostics for the first time, past the reception desk Priya had insisted on decorating with a small brass plaque that read, "Founded on patience, built on proof," my mother stood very still for a long moment, taking in the equipment, the whiteboards covered in chemical structures, the framed photograph on my office wall of Sophie and Adam standing in front of the building on opening day, and she started, quietly, to cry. I should have hung your diploma in a better place than the hardware store, she said. I should have hung it somewhere that told you I understood what it meant. You're here now, I told her, and I meant it as forgiveness, though I understood, even as I said it, that forgiveness and forgetting were not the same thing, and I had no intention of doing the second one, only the first. Priscilla Woodard called me again in January, this time to ask if I would sit for a longer, more personal profile piece, not about the deal, not about the collapse of the Meridian acquisition, but about the year that followed, about what it looked like to build a company from a rented brewery turned warehouse after 2 decades of being systematically uncredited by the people who claim to love you. I said yes this time, with far less hesitation than I'd expected to feel. Why now? Priscilla asked, once we were settled into the small conference room at Hale Diagnostics, a room whose walls I had, in a moment of quiet defiance, I still find myself smiling about. Painted the exact shade of blue that had been on the walls of Walter Callahan's office for as long as I'd known him, not out of any desire to honor him, but because I had genuinely liked the color and had spent 11 years denying myself the small pleasure of choosing it for a space of my own, simply because it had first belonged to someone else. You were fairly guarded during the first round of coverage. What changed? I think, at the time, I was still protecting myself, I told her. I was worried that if I spoke too openly, people would decide the whole story was really about revenge, about a bitter ex-wife burning down her husband's family for spite. And that was never what it was. What it actually was 14 years of a woman doing extraordinary work and letting other people take credit for it because she'd been taught her entire life that the alternative, insisting on recognition, insisting on ownership, insisting on being seen, made her difficult, or unlikable, or ungrateful. I wanted the first story to be about the facts. Now I think I'm ready for it to be about the truth underneath the facts. And what's the truth underneath the facts? I thought about that question for a long moment, looking out the window at the parking lot of my own building, where my own name was on a sign I had chosen myself, in a font I had chosen myself. Above a door I unlocked every morning with a key that belonged to no one but me. The truth is that being kind and being invisible are not the same thing, I said finally. I spent most of my adult life believing that if I made myself indispensable enough, quiet enough, generous enough with my credit, someone would eventually notice and reward me for it without my ever having to ask. I don't believe that anymore. I think the world rewards people who insist on being seen, and I think women, especially women my age, especially women who were raised the way I was raised, are taught that insisting on being seen is a kind of vanity, a kind of selfishness, instead of what it actually is, which is basic self-respect. I'm 47 years old. It took me until this year to understand that I was allowed to want credit for my own work without that wanting making me a worse person. The article ran 3 weeks later under the headline, "Nora Hale Isn't Sorry Anymore," and I keep a framed copy of it on the wall of my office, not out of vanity, but as a reminder, on the difficult days, of exactly how long it took me to earn the right to stop apologizing for taking up space in my own life. I should tell you about the day I ran into Walter Callahan again, because I think it's the moment that, more than any legal victory or press coverage, actually closed the door on that entire chapter of my life. It was late February, almost a year after the boardroom meeting, and I was at a regional biotech conference in Boston, the same city where I had met Preston 22 years earlier, presenting an early data set from one of Hale Diagnostics' new compounds to a room of maybe 60 people, mostly independent clinic operators and a scattering of smaller venture funds. I saw Walter across the hotel lobby afterward, standing near the registration desk, older than I remembered him, his posture carrying a heaviness that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the year he'd had. Callahan Biosciences had survived, technically, but survival was a generous word for what remained. A smaller, chastened company, its reputation permanently marked by the Meridian collapse, its remaining board members far more cautious, far more willing, I'd heard secondhand, to actually ask questions of the people doing the work instead of assuming credit belonged automatically to whoever held the most senior title. Walter saw me and, for a moment, I watched him decide whether to approach or retreat. He approached. "Nora," he said, "you look well." "I am well, Walter." "The company's doing better," he said, in the tone of a man offering information nobody had asked for because he needed badly to say it out loud to someone who would understand its true weight. "Smaller, slower, but better, I think, in some ways. Blair's actually running the science division now, properly. She went back and got a master's in molecular biology last year. Did you know that?" "I didn't," I said, and I felt a small, genuine warmth at the news. Good for her. Wrong, and it cost this family more than money. I looked at my former father-in-law, a man who had shaped so much of my adult life, for better and for worse, and I felt, to my own surprise, no particular satisfaction in his apology. I felt instead something quieter, a kind of closure, the sense of a door finally, gently clicking shut. "Thank you for saying that, Walter," I said. "I hope the company finds its footing. I really do. But I don't think I need anything else from this conversation. I think I said everything I needed to say a long time ago, in a boardroom, and nobody was listening. I'm glad someone's finally listening now, even if it's a year too late for it to change anything between us." He nodded, understanding, I think, exactly what I meant, and we said a brief, civil goodbye, and I walked back to my hotel room and called Sophie, just to hear her voice, just to remind myself of the life I had actually built, the one that had nothing to do with Walter Callahan's approval at all. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes after a victory, one that nobody warns you about. And I think it's important that I talk about it honestly, because I know some of the women watching this are standing right where I stood that spring, having won, in whatever form winning took for them, and finding the victory strangely quiet, almost anticlimactic, compared to the years of struggle that preceded it. I had my company. I had my children, thriving in ways that made my chest ache with pride nearly every day. I had a settlement that gave me financial security I had never fully possessed, even during 19 years of marriage to a wealthy family, because security, I had learned, is not the same thing as access. I had lived for 2 decades inside considerable family wealth while never once having a bank account that was entirely, unquestionably my own to control without explanation. I had all of that. And still, some evenings, after Sophie left for her freshman year at college, and Adam moved into an apartment closer to the warehouse so he could keep his own hours without disturbing mine, I found myself sitting alone in a large house with black shutters, surrounded by hydrangeas I had planted for a family that no longer lived inside those walls the way it once had, feeling a hollowness I couldn't entirely explain. I told Renata about it over lunch one Tuesday, the twice-yearly ritual we had somehow, over the course of the last year, turned into something closer to monthly. "I keep waiting to feel triumphant," I admitted. "Everyone treats this like a triumph story. Priscilla wrote it as a triumph story. My own children talk about it like I slayed a dragon. Some days I just feel tired and a little bit sad, and I don't know what to do with that, because it doesn't fit the narrative everyone else has decided this is." Renata set down her fork and looked at me with the particular directness that had made her, over the years, one of the only people I trusted to tell me the truth without cushioning it. "Nora, you spent 19 years married to a man who cheated on you, and 22 years working for a family that took credit for your genius, and you did the hardest thing a person can do, which is walk away from a life you built with your own hands because that life was no longer serving you. That's not a story that resolves into simple triumph. That's grief, layered underneath a victory, and both things are allowed to be true at the same time. You're allowed to be proud of what you built and sad about what you lost. Those aren't contradictions. They're just what it actually feels like to be a whole, complicated human being who survived something enormous. I thought about that conversation for weeks afterward, turning it over in my mind during the long drives to the warehouse, during the quiet evenings alone in a house too big for one person, and I came, slowly, to a kind of peace with the complexity of it. The understanding that healing was not a single door I walked through and emerged transformed on the other side, but a long, uneven hallway, full of rooms I would need to sit in for as long as they required. Grief and pride and exhaustion and hope, all taking turns holding my hand. It was during this period, the quiet, complicated middle of my healing, that I met Marcus's older brother, a structural engineer named Theo Webb, at a small dinner Marcus hosted for the Hale Diagnostics team to celebrate our first full year of operation. I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because I know some of you watching are hoping for a romance, a clean, satisfying resolution where the wronged woman finds a good man who finally treats her the way she deserved all along. And I understand that hope, because I held it myself for a long time. But I also think it's important to tell you that I did not need Theo to complete my story. I had already, by the time I met him, built something whole on my own. A company, a rebuilt relationship with my mother, a closeness with my children that felt, for the first time in years, entirely honest. Theo did not arrive to fix anything that was broken. He arrived instead into a life that was already, quietly, functioning. He was 51, divorced himself, with 2 grown children he clearly adored and spoke about with an easy, unguarded warmth I found myself noticing, almost against my will, because it was so different from the careful, performative fatherhood Preston had always practiced in front of an audience. Theo asked me questions about my work that were genuinely curious rather than politely tolerant. When I explained the biochemistry behind one of our newer compounds, he did not nod along the way Preston had for 2 decades, pretending to follow a conversation he had never once tried to actually understand. He asked follow-up questions, good ones, the kind that told me he was actually listening. "Can I be honest with you?" he said, near the end of that first dinner, as the rest of the team drifted toward the door and it was just the 2 of us left at the table, nursing the last of a bottle of wine Priya had brought. "I read that article about you in the fall. The long one. The personal profile. I looked you up afterward, mostly out of curiosity, and I've been quietly hoping Marcus would eventually invite me to one of these dinners so I'd have an excuse to actually meet you." "That's either very charming or slightly alarming," I said, and I meant it as a joke. But underneath the joke was a genuine flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. The small, unfamiliar thrill of being seen not for what I could produce, but simply for who I was. "I promise it's meant as the first one," he said. "I read that article, and I kept thinking about one line in particular. You said something about spending your whole life believing that if you made yourself indispensable enough, someone would eventually notice and reward you without you ever having to ask. I've thought about that line probably a dozen times since I read it. I think a lot of people, men included, spend their lives waiting to be noticed instead of learning how to actually ask for what they want. I liked that you finally stopped waiting. We did not fall into a whirlwind romance that night, or even that month. We took things slowly, carefully, the way 2 people in their late 40s who have both been hurt before tend to take things when they've finally learned, the hard way, the cost of moving too fast towards something that isn't built to last. But over the following year, Theo Webb became a steady, gentle presence in my life. Not a rescue, not a resolution, simply a good man who liked to hear about my work, who showed up early to help me set up folding chairs for Hale Diagnostics' second annual company barbecue, who never once, in all the months I came to know him, made me feel like my success was something he needed to compete with or diminish in order to feel secure in himself. I want to close this story by telling you about the second 4th of July, the one that fell a full year after the barbecue at the Callahan Lake House, where Blair had asked me, with total sincerity, about an IP structure she had 4 weeks and every opportunity to investigate and never did. Hale Diagnostics hosted its own barbecue that year. In the parking lot behind the warehouse, string lights hung between the loading dock and a row of newly planted trees Adam had insisted on, because, he said, if we're going to have a company, we're going to have a company with a little bit of green space, Mom. I'm not spending my 20s working in a parking lot with no shade. My mother came, driving up from Hartford with a potato salad recipe she'd never once made for me as a child, because, she told me quietly while setting it on the folding table, I want to start making things for you the way I always made them for Danny. It's overdue, but I'd like to try, if you'll let me. Sophie came home from her sophomore year with a research position lined up for the following summer, in a lab studying the exact class of diagnostic compounds I had built my career around, a coincidence she swore was not intentional, and that I privately, joyfully, did not believe for a second. Adam manned the grill with the same seriousness he brought to every task, occasionally shouting instructions at Priya and Marcus, who ignored him with the easy affection of colleagues who had become something closer to family over the 14 months since we'd first opened the doors. Theo arrived a little after 6, carrying a case of good beer and a bouquet of sunflowers he handed me with an unguarded, almost boyish smile. And I found myself standing in the parking lot of a company that bore my name, surrounded by people who had chosen to be there, not out of obligation, not out of family duty, not out of the quiet, exhausting performance of loyalty I had spent 19 years mistaking for love, but because they genuinely, freely wanted to be. I thought, standing there in the golden evening light, about the woman I had been in that boardroom 14 months earlier, sitting very still while Walter Callahan told me my role was being restructured, while Blair called me sweetie in a tone reserved for children, while Preston looked at his phone instead of at his wife of 19 years. I thought about how small I had made myself, for so long, in service of a peace that had never actually protected me, only postponed the reckoning I eventually, quietly, had to face alone. And I thought, too, about the version of this story that some of you might have wanted, the version with more shouting, more confrontation, more dramatic scenes of the wronged woman standing in a boardroom delivering a speech that brings her enemies to their knees. That is not, in the end, the story I actually lived. My revenge, if you want to call it that, was quieter than that, and slower, and in some ways, harder. The revenge of simply refusing to keep making myself smaller, of trusting a legal structure I had built 14 years earlier out of a father's one piece of unsolicited wisdom, of waiting, with a discipline that cost me more than anyone watching from the outside would ever understand, for the truth to arrive on its own timeline instead of forcing it into existence before it was ready. If you've made it this far in my story, I suspect you're carrying something similar to what I carried for most of my adult life. The quiet, corrosive belief that being useful is the same thing as being valued, that keeping the peace is the same thing as keeping your dignity, that the people who benefit most from your silence will eventually, someday on their own, decide you deserve to be seen. I want to tell you, from the other side of that belief, that it is not true. Nobody is coming to notice you unless you first insist on being visible. Nobody is coming to give you credit unless you first understand, clearly and without apology, exactly what you are owed. I do not say this bitterly. I do not even say it about the Callahans specifically anymore, because I have, in the 2 years since that boardroom meeting, largely made my peace with them. Blair and I exchange occasional emails about the biotech industry, professional and warm in a way that would have surprised the versions of both of us who stood in that lake house parking lot. My mother and I speak every week now, a habit that still occasionally catches me by surprise with how much I've come to treasure it. Even Preston and I have settled, slowly, into the careful, functional co-parenting relationship that our children deserved all along, one built on boundaries rather than performance. What I say this for, instead, is for the woman watching this video tonight who has spent years building something extraordinary for someone else's benefit, who has trained herself to celebrate other people's credit for her own labor, who has told herself, over and over, that patience and kindness require silence as their price of admission. I want you to know that they don't. I want you to know that you are allowed to hold on to what is legally, rightfully, undeniably yours, even when the people around you have decided, without ever asking you a single question, that it belongs to them instead. I built Hale Diagnostics into a company that today employs 41 people, most of them women who left larger, more prestigious institutions because they were tired of doing extraordinary work for men who took the credit and kept the corner office. We hold, as of this year, 19 active patents, 3 of which are already showing results in early clinical trials that could, within a few more years, change how a dozen serious conditions are diagnosed in their earliest, most treatable stages. None of it happened because I demanded a confrontation, or delivered a triumphant speech, or burned down every bridge behind me out of spite. It happened because, after 22 years of making myself smaller for other people's comfort, I finally, quietly, patiently, let the truth of what I had built stand on its own, and waited for the people who had never bothered to ask me the right question to finally, belatedly, understand exactly what they had lost. You do not need to be loud to be powerful. You do not need to seek revenge to find justice. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to the people who underestimated you is simply, calmly, without a single raised voice, become exactly as extraordinary as you always secretly knew yourself to be, and let them watch, from the outside, as you build a life they no longer have any claim to at all. I have told you the shape of the story, but I realize now, looking back over everything I've shared, that I skipped past some of the harder days in the middle, the ones that didn't make it into Priscilla Woodard's articles, the ones that never got smoothed into a tidy narrative arc, because they were simply too raw, too unglamorous, too much like the ordinary grind of surviving a life falling apart in slow motion. I think those days matter too, and I want to go back and tell you about them honestly, because I think the women watching this deserve the full texture of what rebuilding actually looks like, not just the highlight reel. There was a Tuesday in August, 3 weeks after the Meridian deal collapsed, when I sat in a deposition room for 6 hours while Meridian's outside counsel asked me, in exhaustive, methodical detail, to walk through the entire history of the Hale Diagnostics licensing structure. Every decision, every date, every conversation with Renata going back 14 years. It was not a hostile deposition. Meridian had no reason to be hostile toward me, since my patents were the very thing that had made the platform valuable enough to pursue in the first place. But it was exhausting in a way I hadn't anticipated. The particular exhaustion of narrating your own life's most private, complicated decisions to a room full of strangers in expensive suits, all of them taking notes. All of them building a case that had nothing to do with me personally, and everything to do with which multinational corporation would ultimately end up controlling the technology I had built. I remember driving home from that deposition, past the exit for the Callahan Biosciences headquarters, and feeling, for the first time since the boardroom meeting, a genuine wave of doubt. What if Renata was wrong about something? What if some technicality in the 2011 paperwork unraveled under scrutiny? What if, after everything, I ended up not just without my marriage and my old career, but without the one asset I had spent 14 years quietly protecting? I called Renata from the car, my voice shaking in a way I hadn't allowed it to shake in months. What if this doesn't hold up? It's going to hold up, Nora, she said, with the calm certainty of a woman who had read every page of that documentation a dozen times over the years. I know you're scared. That's allowed. But the paperwork is clean. It was clean in 2011, and it's clean now. You're allowed to be frightened and still trust the work we did together. She was right, of course. The structure held. But I think it's important to tell you that I was scared, deeply and repeatedly, throughout that entire year. That courage, as I came to understand it, was never the absence of fear, only the discipline to keep moving forward through it. One deposition, one difficult phone call, one lonely evening at a time. There was also a night in September, a month I don't often talk about, when Ashley Kirkpatrick, Preston's mistress, Blair's former assistant, a young woman I had personally trained and had every reason to resent, showed up unannounced at the warehouse, 20 minutes before closing, asking to speak with me. I almost turned her away. Priya, standing beside me at the reception desk, actually asked if she should call security, a suggestion I appreciated more than I let on. But something in Ashley's face, a kind of raw, unguarded exhaustion I recognized, because I had worn it myself for most of the previous year, made me tell Priya it was fine, and led Ashley into the small conference room with the blue walls. I don't expect you to be kind to me, Ashley said, sitting across from me, her hands twisting in her lap. I just wanted to say, before I moved to Chicago for a new job, that I'm sorry. Preston told me things about your marriage that I now understand weren't entirely true, that you two had been separated in every way that mattered for years, that he was staying only for the kids, that you two barely spoke. I was 29, and I believed a 49-year-old man's version of his own marriage because it was easier than asking harder questions. I understand now that I let myself be a tool in something much bigger than I realized, and I'm sorry for the part I played in it, even if I didn't fully understand, at the time, what I was actually part of. I sat with her apology for a long moment, feeling a complicated tangle of emotions I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness. Exactly. Not yet. But something adjacent to it. A recognition that Ashley Kirkpatrick had been, in her own way, another young woman navigating a family that had never taught her to question the stories powerful men told about their own lives. I appreciate you saying that, I told her. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't still hurt. But I hope you learn, faster than I did, to ask harder questions of the men who tell you convenient stories about themselves. Good luck in Chicago, Ashley. She left with tears in her eyes, and I sat alone in that conference room for a long time afterward, thinking about how betrayal, in families like the Callahans, rarely stays contained to a single relationship. It ripples outward, catching younger, less powerful people in its wake, people who often don't fully understand, until much later, exactly what they were used for. I should also tell you about the week in October when a competing diagnostics firm, Bardsley Analytics, attempted what I can only describe as a coordinated poaching campaign against Hale Diagnostics, reaching out individually to Priya, to Marcus, and to two of our newer hires with offers that were, on paper, financially generous. And, as I discovered later through an industry contact, quietly funded by a consulting arrangement that traced back, through two shell layers, to a company called Ridgeline Strategic Partners. Vivian, it turned out, had not simply disappeared quietly after the anonymous folder reached Callahan Biosciences auditors. She had been asked to resign from her remaining board position, had settled a smaller embezzlement claim out of court to avoid a criminal referral, and had apparently spent the following months channeling what remained of her financial leverage into an attempt to systematically dismantle the one thing that had, in her mind, caused her downfall: my company. I found out about the connection to Ridgeline the same week Priya came to me, visibly conflicted, holding a formal offer letter from Bardsley Analytics that would have doubled her salary. "I want you to know I'm not taking it," she said, setting the letter on my desk. "But I also want you to know it exists, because something about the timing feels strange to me, and I trust you to tell me if I'm wrong to feel that way." I was not wrong, and neither was she. When Renata and I traced the funding back to Vivian, I felt something harden in me that I hadn't expected. Not rage, exactly, but a cold, clarifying resolve. I had chosen not to weaponize the Ridgeline folder against Vivian directly, out of a genuine desire to let that particular reckoning belong to her and her family, rather than to me. But I had never promised her, or anyone, that I would sit quietly while she tried to dismantle the company I had built from nothing. I called Renata that same afternoon. "I want to talk about a cease and desist," I said. "And I want to talk about whether there's a tortious interference claim buried in a poaching campaign funded by embezzled money that already triggered an auditor's investigation." "Now you're talking like a founder who understands her own leverage," Renata said, and I could hear, again, that particular note of professional delight in her voice. "Let's build the case." The legal letter Renata's firm sent to Vivian's attorney that November was, by design, restrained. A clear statement of the evidence we had gathered, a demand that the poaching campaign cease immediately, and a pointed reminder that further interference would result in a civil suit that would almost certainly reopen the embezzlement question in a much more public forum than the quiet settlement Vivian had managed to negotiate earlier that year. It worked. The poaching offers stopped within a week. I never spoke to Vivian directly about any of it, and to this day, I don't know whether she ever fully understood how close she came to losing the fragile privacy she had managed to preserve around her own financial reckoning. What I do know is that Priya, Marcus, and the rest of the team stayed. Not because I'd matched Bardsley's salary offers. I hadn't. Not entirely. Not yet. Because Hale Diagnostics was still a company finding its financial footing. But because, as Priya told me over coffee a few weeks later, "I've worked for people who treat you like a resource, and I've worked for you. I know which one actually sees me as a person. Money's important, Nora, but it's not the only thing that keeps good people in a room." That conversation stayed with me through the winter, through the long, cold months of building a fledgling company's second year, through the careful, unglamorous work of securing our second round of clinical partnerships, hiring 3 more scientists, negotiating our first real office lease instead of the month-to-month warehouse arrangement we'd started with. I thought about it especially on the difficult days, the days when cash flow felt tight, and I found myself briefly missing the resources of a company like Callahan Biosciences, before reminding myself every single time exactly what those resources had cost me in terms of dignity, credit, and the simple, basic experience of being taken seriously. By the second spring, Hale Diagnostics had grown enough that I found myself, for the first time in my career, in the position Walter Callahan had occupied for 30 years. The founder, the person whose name was on the door, responsible not just for the science, but for the culture of an entire organization. I thought about that responsibility constantly, turning it over during long drives home, determined that whatever else I built, I would not accidentally recreate the very dynamics that had cost me 14 years of my own life. I instituted a policy, early on, that patents connected to any employee's original contribution would list that employee by name, regardless of seniority. A policy Priya told me, with something like disbelief, she had never once encountered at any of her previous positions. I made sure that when trade publications wrote about Hale Diagnostics' early clinical results, the quotes attributed to specific scientists went to the scientists who had actually done the work. Not simply funneled upward to me as founder, the way credit had always funneled upward to Walter, regardless of who in the building had actually earned it. Marcus, in a team meeting that spring, said something that I still think about often. I've worked in labs my whole career where the founder's name ends up on everything, even when the founder hasn't touched a pipette in a decade. I think what makes this place different isn't just that you're a good scientist, Nora. It's that you remember, every single day, what it felt like to not get credit for your own work. And you've built an entire company structure specifically, so nobody else here has to live through what you lived through. I did not respond to that comment right away, because I felt, unexpectedly, close to tears in front of my own team, and I had spent enough of my life learning the discipline of composure that I wasn't quite ready to abandon it entirely, even in a moment as tender as that one. But I thought about it for weeks afterward, and I understood, slowly, that building a place where the mistakes of my old life could not quietly repeat themselves in the lives of the people around me, had become, without my fully realizing it, the deepest purpose of everything I'd built. I want to tell you, too, about the moment I finally, fully let go of the anger I had carried toward Preston, because I think it happened in a way that surprised even me. It was a Saturday in late spring, almost 2 years after the boardroom meeting, and I was at Adams College graduation. He'd finished his degree part-time while working full-time at Hale Diagnostics, a decision that had cost him some of the traditional college experience but had, by his own account, given him something far more valuable. A real career, built alongside people who respected him, instead of 4 more years of unpaid internships chasing his father's approval. Preston was there, of course, sitting 3 rows behind me with a woman I didn't recognize, someone he'd apparently been dating for several months, according to Sophie, who kept better track of her father's life than I did by that point. Mostly out of the particular vigilance children develop after watching a marriage collapse in front of them. After the ceremony, in the crowded, noisy chaos of parents finding their graduates, Preston approached me, alone, his date having wandered off to find the restroom. "He's built something real," Preston said, nodding toward Adam, who was being embraced by Priya and Marcus a few yards away, the 3 of them laughing about something none of the rest of us could hear. "I keep thinking about how much of that is you. How much of everything good in both our kids is you, honestly. I don't think I said that enough, when we were married. I don't think I said a lot of things enough." I looked at my former husband, a man I had once loved with the whole, unguarded certainty of a 27-year-old who believed love was simple, and I felt, for the first time since the boardroom, something that was neither anger nor grief, but a quiet, settled kind of peace. "Thank you for saying that, Preston," I said. "I think we both made mistakes in that marriage. I let myself become invisible because it felt easier than fighting to be seen. You let yourself believe that invisibility meant I didn't need to be seen at all. I don't think either one of us handled it well. But I'm glad our kids turned out the way they did, in spite of both of us, not because of either of us alone." "For what it's worth," Preston said, "I'm proud of what you built. I don't think I have any right to say that anymore, but I am." I did not need his pride. I want to be clear about that, because I think it's important. I had, by that point, built an entire life that no longer required Preston Callahan's validation to feel complete. But I received it anyway, that afternoon, in the noisy chaos of our son's graduation, and I let myself feel it, briefly, as one small closing note in a much longer song. Not the resolution of the story, because the resolution had already happened, quietly, over the 2 years I had spent building something entirely my own, but simply a final, gentle acknowledgement that even the people who had once diminished me were capable, eventually, of seeing clearly what they had almost lost. I think it's worth pausing here to talk about the practical realities of rebuilding a life at 46, 47, 48 years old, because I know some of the women watching this are not wondering about patent law or corporate espionage. They're wondering about the smaller, more immediate question of whether it's actually possible to start over at this age, in this body, with these responsibilities, without a guaranteed safety net waiting on the other side. I will tell you honestly, the first year was financially frightening in a way that 19 years of marriage to considerable family wealth had never prepared me for. I had savings, yes, carefully kept in an account under my own name, but savings meant to cushion a temporary setback are not the same thing as capital sufficient to fund a diagnostic startup. And there were months during that first year when I genuinely did not know whether Hale Diagnostics would survive long enough to see its first real revenue. I remember a Tuesday in that first autumn when the warehouse's ancient heating system failed, and the quote to repair it came in at just under $11,000, an amount that would have been laughably insignificant during my marriage, and felt, in that moment, like it might sink an entire company I had poured everything into. I sat in my car in the warehouse parking lot that afternoon and did the math 3 separate times, trying to find a version of the numbers that didn't require me to either delay Priya and Marcus's paychecks or dip into the college fund I had set aside for Sophie years earlier, back when I still believed the Callahan family's wealth would always be there to cushion any real emergency. I called my mother that night, mostly because I needed to hear a voice that wasn't running numbers alongside me, and when I told her about the heating system, about the $11,000, about the particular exhaustion of being 46 years old, and terrified about money in a way I hadn't been since graduate school, she said something I have carried with me ever since. Nora, when your father and I opened the hardware store, we ate rice and beans for 8 months and slept on a mattress on the floor because we'd spent everything we had on inventory and a lease. Nobody remembers that part of our story. Everyone just remembers that the store eventually did well enough to send you to college. I think you're in the rice and beans part of your story right now. I think it's the hardest part, and I also think it's the part that someday you'll barely remember, because you'll be too busy living in the version of your life that came after it. I fixed the heating system with a small business loan Denise Okonkwo Bright's fund helped me structure 2 months later, once our first clinical partnership revenue started coming in. And I want to tell you, honestly, that the fear of those early months never fully disappeared. It simply, slowly, became a smaller and smaller part of each week, crowded out gradually by the growing, undeniable evidence that the thing I was building actually worked. There was another financial reckoning I haven't mentioned yet, one that I think matters enormously for the women watching this, who are considering leaving a marriage or a career that has quietly hollowed them out over years of accumulated compromise. The question of what, exactly, 19 years of unpaid or underpaid domestic and professional labor is actually worth, in dollars, when a marriage finally ends. Renata, during our divorce negotiations, insisted on something I had never once considered on my own, a formal accounting, presented to the court, of the economic value of the work I had contributed to Callahan Biosciences during the years my compensation had been structured, quietly and consistently, well below market rate for someone of my role and expertise, a discrepancy Walter had always framed as keeping it in the family, and I had always, foolishly, accepted as a reasonable arrangement between people who loved each other. You were paid 62% of what an outside chief science officer with your patent portfolio would have commanded at a comparable company, Renata told me, laying out a stack of comparative salary data during one of our preparation meetings. For 11 years. That's not a family discount, Nora. That's over $2 million in unpaid market value, and I intend to make that number impossible for anyone in that courtroom to ignore. I remember feeling, sitting in Renata's office reviewing those numbers, a complicated mixture of vindication and grief. Vindication, because I had always sensed, in some quiet corner of myself, that I was being systematically undervalued. And grief, because sensing it and having it confirmed in cold, undeniable spreadsheet form were two very different experiences, and the second one hurt in a way I hadn't fully braced myself for. The eventual settlement reflected that accounting, along with a fair division of the marital assets we had built together over 19 years, and while I want to be careful not to turn this part of the story into a simple lesson about money, because the deepest wound, for me, was never really financial. I do think it's important to say clearly, for anyone watching who is quietly wondering whether their own years of underpaid, undercredited labor inside a marriage or a family business actually matter in the eyes of the law. They do. Document everything. Keep your own records. Understand your own market value, even when the people around you have every incentive to keep you from ever calculating it. I want to tell you about a moment that happened almost exactly 2.5 years after the boardroom meeting, because I think it's the moment that finally, fully closed the circle of this entire story. Hale Diagnostics had by then moved out of the converted brewery warehouse and into a proper office and laboratory complex 20 minutes from my house, a building with our name on a sign out front in the exact shade of blue I had once, quietly, defiantly chosen for a single conference room. We had 63 employees. We had 11 active patents fully our own, plus the original portfolio I had carried with me from the Hale Diagnostics licensing days, and a clinical validation program for a new early detection compound that had, just that spring, produced results promising enough that two of the largest health systems in the Northeast had reached out independently to discuss potential partnerships. I was invited that spring to speak at the same regional biotech conference in Boston, where I had run into Walter 2 years earlier, this time not as a presenter sharing an early data set to a room of 60 people, but as a keynote speaker addressing the conference's full assembly of nearly 1,000 attendees, on a panel about founder resilience and the future of independent diagnostics companies in an industry increasingly dominated by consolidation and acquisition. I stood at that podium, in a navy suit Sophie had helped me choose, looking out at a room full of scientists and investors and industry journalists, including, I noticed, Priscilla Woodard sitting in the third row with her notebook open, and I told them, not the story of betrayal and legal maneuvering that had made headlines 2 years earlier, but the story underneath it, the one I think matters most. I spent 14 years building something extraordinary inside someone else's company, I told the room. And I let that company believe, for most of those years, that my contribution was simply a natural extension of my marriage into that family, rather than what it actually was. Independent, valuable, protectable work that deserved its own recognition and its own name. I want to tell every scientist in this room, especially the women, especially the ones who have spent years quietly doing extraordinary work while someone else's name goes on the door. Your work belongs to you until you sign something that says otherwise. And even then, read every single word of what you're signing, because someday, the difference between the words assigned and exclusively licensed might be the difference between building a life on your own terms and watching someone else build it for you. The room was quiet for a moment after I finished, and then, slowly, it erupted into an applause that lasted longer than I expected. Long enough that I found myself, standing at that podium, blinking back tears I hadn't planned on shedding in front of 1,000 strangers. Afterward, in the crowded reception that followed, a young woman approached me. She couldn't have been older than 28, wearing a lanyard identifying her as a research scientist at a mid-size pharmaceutical company I recognized, but won't name here, out of respect for whatever difficult decision she might still be navigating. "I needed to hear that today," she said, her voice tight with an emotion I recognized instantly, because I had lived inside it myself for so many years. I've been the lead scientist on a project at my company for 3 years, and last month they promoted my manager, a man who has never once run an assay in his life, to head the division I basically built. I keep telling myself it's fine, that credit doesn't really matter as long as the work gets done, that I'm not the kind of person who needs recognition. But listening to you today, I don't think that's actually true. I think I've just been telling myself that story because it's easier than admitting how much it hurts. I looked at this young woman, who reminded me so powerfully of myself at her age, brilliant, quietly furious, and utterly convinced that her fury made her difficult rather than simply reasonably human. And I told her the thing I most wished someone had told me 20 years earlier. "It's not fine," I said. "You're allowed to want credit for your own work. You're allowed to document everything, quietly, patiently, the way I did, and you're allowed to wait for the right moment to make sure the truth of what you've built can never again be casually handed to someone else. It might take you years. It took me 14, but I promise you, the version of yourself who finally insists on being seen is worth becoming, even if it takes longer than you'd like." She thanked me, tears in her eyes, and disappeared back into the crowd, and I stood there for a long moment, thinking about the strange, unexpected shape my life had taken. How a boardroom betrayal, the worst professional and personal blow I had ever experienced, had somehow led me, 2.5 years later, to a hotel ballroom in Boston, offering the exact piece of wisdom to a stranger that I most needed and never received, at the beginning of my own long, difficult, ultimately worthwhile journey. I want to close this story properly, because I know it has been a long one, longer than most of the stories I imagine you're used to hearing, but I think some stories simply require the full length of their truth to be told honestly, without shortcuts, without skipping past the difficult, unglamorous middle in favor of a tidier ending. Today, as I record this, I am 49 years old. Hale Diagnostics employs 68 people and holds, as of last month, 22 active patents, 3 of which are now in advanced clinical trials that could, within the next several years, meaningfully change how early-stage disease is detected across a range of serious conditions. Sophie graduated with honors and is now pursuing her own doctorate in molecular diagnostics, working, this past summer, as an intern in my own company's research division, insisting, over my initial objections, on being treated exactly like every other intern, with no special privileges attached to her last name. Adam is Hale Diagnostics' Director of Operations, a title he earned through 3 years of genuinely excellent work rather than any accident of birth, and he tells me, often, that he considers the collapse of his unpaid internship at that biotech incubator the single luckiest thing that ever happened to his career. My mother and I speak every week. Danny and I have grown closer than we've ever been, in part because he, too, eventually confronted our parents about the imbalance of attention we'd both absorbed without ever fully naming it, and we've found, in our 40s, a friendship neither of us managed to build in our 20s or 30s. Preston and I maintain a civil, functional co-parenting relationship, and I have genuinely forgiven him. Not because he necessarily earned that forgiveness through the ordinary means of amends and repair, but because I came to understand, slowly, that forgiveness was ultimately a gift I was giving myself, a way of finally setting down a weight I had carried long enough. Theo and I have been together for 1.5 years now, slowly, steadily, without any of the urgency or performance that characterized so much of my first marriage, and I find myself, at 49, more certain of who I am and what I deserve than I have ever been at any previous point in my life. Walter Callahan retired last year. Blair now runs what remains of Callahan Biosciences, a smaller, more careful company than it once was, and she called me, a few months ago, to ask if Hale Diagnostics would be interested in a joint clinical research partnership. A professional conversation, conducted between equals, that neither of us, I think, could have imagined having 2.5 years earlier, sitting in that lake house parking lot, one of us finally, belatedly asking the right question, and the other one finally, freely willing to answer it. I have thought often, in the years since that boardroom meeting, about the exact moment everything began to shift. Not the moment Walter announced my removal, though that was the moment the world could see, but an earlier moment, months before, that I never mentioned to Priscilla Woodard, never mentioned to Renata even, until much later, because I wasn't entirely sure, for a long time, what to make of it myself. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday, nearly a year before the boardroom meeting, during a routine budget review for the following year's research pipeline. I had proposed funding for the 3 new compounds that would eventually become the foundation of Hale Diagnostics. Modest funding, by the standards of a company about to close a $2.4 billion acquisition, perhaps $800,000 spread across 18 months, a rounding error in the context of everything else moving through that budget. Walter had denied the request in less than 4 minutes, without asking a single question about the underlying science, citing the need to keep the team focused on Velostat through the Meridian conversation. Blair, sitting beside him, had added, almost as an afterthought, "Besides, Nora, don't you think you've got enough on your plate already, between the lab and everything at home? Maybe this is a good year to simplify." I remember driving home that evening feeling something I couldn't quite name at the time, not the sharp, immediate sting of the boardroom betrayal that would come later, but a slower, colder recognition, the sense of a door quietly closing somewhere just out of view. I remember deciding, that same night, sitting at my kitchen table long after Preston and the children had gone to bed, that I would fund the 3 compounds myself, quietly, using my own money and my own after-hours time, not because I had any premonition of what was coming 8 months later in that boardroom, but simply because I had grown tired in some fundamental, wordless way of asking permission to pursue work I knew, with total scientific confidence, was worth pursuing. I think about that decision often because I believe it was the true beginning of everything that followed, not the legal structure I built in 2011, which simply protected what I already had, but the quiet, private decision, made alone at a kitchen table on an unremarkable Wednesday night, to stop waiting for anyone else's approval before building the next chapter of my own work. Every important turning point in my life, I have come to understand, arrived first as a small private act of self-trust, long before it ever became visible to anyone else. I also want to tell you about a conversation I had with Sophie during her sophomore year of college, one that I think captures, more honestly than almost anything else in this story, what it actually means to raise a daughter while simultaneously rebuilding your own sense of worth from the ground up. She called me late one night, upset, having just ended a relationship with a boyfriend who had, over the course of several months, developed a habit of subtly minimizing her academic accomplishments in front of his friends, introducing her as, "My girlfriend, she's pre-med. It's kind of a lot," in a tone that made her achievements sound like a burden rather than something to be proud of. "I kept telling myself I was overreacting," Sophie said, her voice thick with the particular exhaustion of a 20-year-old encountering, for the first time in her own relationship, a pattern she had watched her mother live inside for 2 decades. "And then I thought about you, Mom, about how long you let Dad and the whole Callahan family treat your work like it was a nice hobby you happened to be good at, and I thought, I am not doing that. I am not spending the next 20 years of my life training myself to shrink so someone else feels bigger." I felt, listening to my daughter articulate a lesson it had taken me until my mid-40s to fully understand. An overwhelming, complicated mixture of pride and grief. Pride, because she had recognized the pattern so much earlier than I had. Grief, because recognizing it had cost her something too. A painful breakup, a lonely late-night phone call, the particular ache of learning a hard truth secondhand through a mother's difficult experience, rather than being spared it entirely. "I'm proud of you," I told her. "And I'm sorry you had to learn that lesson by watching me learn it the hard way first." "Don't be sorry," Sophie said. "I think watching you rebuild everything, from nothing, at 46 years old, taught me more about what I actually deserve than any easier lesson could have. I'd rather learn it now, at 20, from watching you be brave, than learn it at 46, the way you had to." I have thought about that conversation many times since, because I think it captures something essential about the strange, unplanned gift hidden inside even the most painful chapters of our lives. That our children are always watching, always learning, not from the advice we give them directly, but from the way we actually live, the choices we actually make when the stakes are highest and the outcome is least certain. There is one more story I want to tell you, from just this past winter, because I think it illustrates, better than almost anything else, how completely the shape of my life has changed since that boardroom meeting nearly 3 years ago. I was invited to sit on the board of a nonprofit organization that provides legal and financial literacy resources to women navigating divorce, particularly women who, like me, had spent decades inside family businesses or marriages where their financial and professional contributions had never been clearly, formally documented or protected. I accepted immediately, in part because Renata sits on the same board, and in part because I understood, the moment I received the invitation, that this was exactly the kind of work I wanted my hard-won knowledge to eventually serve. During my first board meeting, the executive director shared a statistic that stopped me cold. That the organization's intake surveys consistently found that the majority of women coming through their doors had, at some point during their marriages, contributed significant unpaid or underpaid labor to a family business, and that fewer than 1 in 5 had ever taken any formal legal steps to protect or document that contribution before the marriage began to unravel. I thought, sitting in that meeting, about the version of myself who had gotten lucky, genuinely, undeniably lucky, because my own father had, in one brief, uncharacteristic moment of unsolicited wisdom decades earlier, told me never to let a man's family hold all my paper. I thought about how many women never receive that piece of advice at all, how many spend decades building extraordinary things inside marriages and family businesses, with absolutely nothing protecting their own individual claim to what they've built, simply because nobody ever thought to tell them it was possible, or necessary, to protect it in the first place. I proposed, that same meeting, a new program, free consultations, offered quarterly, connecting women early in their careers or their marriages with intellectual property and family law attorneys, specifically designed to help them understand, before a crisis ever arrives, exactly what they're entitled to protect and how. The board approved it unanimously, and we launched the first session 3 months later, in a modest conference room not unlike the one where I had first sat down with Renata Ibarra 14 years earlier to structure the licensing agreement that would, eventually, change the entire trajectory of my life. I did not tell the room, that first session, the full story of the boardroom and the Meridian deal, and the 11 days it took Callahan Biosciences to notice the license had lapsed. I simply stood at the front of that room and said, "I am here because someone once gave me one piece of advice that ended up protecting 14 years of my life's work. And I want to make sure that advice reaches every single one of you long before you ever need it. I think, in the end, this is the story I most want you to carry away from everything I've shared tonight. Not the details of patents and licensing structures and boardroom betrayals, though those details matter, and I hope some of you find practical wisdom in them for your own lives. What I most want you to carry away is this: the years you spend quietly building something extraordinary, even when nobody around you seems to notice, even when the credit consistently flows to someone else, even when the people who claim to love you treat your genius as a convenient, unpaid resource rather than a gift worth honoring. Those years are not wasted. They are not erased by the people who fail to see them clearly. They remain, always, undeniably yours, waiting for the moment you finally, patiently, courageously decide to claim them fully. I spent 14 years being underestimated by a family that shared my last name and never once bothered to ask me the right question. I spent 19 years married to a man who mistook my quiet competence for a lack of ambition, rather than understanding it as the deepest form of ambition there is, the kind that keeps building, keeps perfecting, keeps protecting itself, even when no one is watching, even when no reward seems likely to ever arrive. I am not going to tell you that the reckoning always comes as neatly, or as completely, as it came for me. I know I was fortunate in ways that not every woman watching this will be fortunate. I had a piece of protective legal advice given to me decades before I needed it. I had savings kept quietly in my own name. I had children old enough to understand what was happening and strong enough to support me through it. I had a friend and attorney in Renata who believed in my case as fiercely as I eventually learned to believe in it myself. Not every story unfolds with such clean, satisfying architecture. Some reckonings take longer. Some never arrive in the tidy public form that mine did. But I do believe this, with everything I have learned over these past 3 years: the discipline of documenting your worth, of protecting what is yours before you ever imagine needing to protect it, of refusing to let silence become the permanent price of peace. That discipline matters, regardless of whether the reckoning ever becomes as visible, as vindicating, as mine ultimately did. Because even if no one else ever notices, even if the boardroom never calls to apologize, even if the acquisition never collapses in a blaze of public reckoning, you will know, quietly, privately, undeniably, exactly what you built, and exactly what you are worth. And in the end, I have come to believe that quiet, private knowledge is the truest foundation any of us ever really need. Thank you for listening to my story tonight. If any part of it resonated with you, if you have lived some version of this same quiet, patient reckoning, I hope you know you are not alone, and I hope, wherever you are in your own journey, that you find the courage to protect what is yours, long before anyone ever asks you to prove it belongs to you at all. I want to go back, briefly, to the partnership conversation I mentioned earlier, because I think the way it unfolded says more about how far all of us had come than almost anything else in this story. Blair called me on a Thursday afternoon in early spring, nearly 3 years after that first catastrophic boardroom meeting, and her voice, when I picked up, carried none of the airy, dismissive confidence I remembered from our early years as sisters-in-law. "I know this might feel strange, given everything," she said. "But I've been running the science division here for almost 2 years now, properly, with an actual master's degree and an actual understanding of what I'm looking at. And I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Hale Diagnostics is doing work in early-stage biomarker detection that complements what we're doing here almost perfectly. I'd like to propose a joint clinical research partnership, not an acquisition, not anything that touches your IP ownership. Just 2 companies, working together, each getting full credit for their own contributions." I sat with the proposal for a long moment before responding, turning over, in my mind, the particular strangeness of the request. A partnership with the very company that had once fired me in a boardroom, offered by the very sister-in-law who had once called me sweetie, in a tone reserved for children who didn't understand how business worked. "I appreciate you asking, Blair," I said finally. "And I want you to know, before I answer, that I don't hold what happened 3 years ago against you the way I once did. You've clearly done the work, both professionally and, it sounds like, personally, and I respect that. But I need you to understand something before we go any further. Any partnership with Hale Diagnostics will need to include full, explicit, contractual credit and compensation structures for every scientist involved, at every level, regardless of seniority or family connection. I built this company specifically so that what happened to me could never quietly happen to anyone working for me. If Callahan Biosciences is prepared to operate on those terms, I'm genuinely interested in talking further." "I'd expect nothing less from you," Blair said, and I could hear, in her voice, something that sounded almost like relief. "For what it's worth, we've already restructured our own crediting policies internally over the last year. I made sure of it myself, actually, right after I finished my degree. I kept thinking about what you told me that day at the lake house, about how nobody had ever bothered to ask you the right question. I didn't want to be the kind of leader who never gets asked the right question either, because nobody around her ever felt safe enough to ask it. We finalized the partnership terms 2 months later, and the first joint clinical trial launched that summer. A strange, unexpected, ultimately hopeful footnote to a story that had begun with such devastating betrayal. Proof, I think, that even the most broken relationships can eventually, slowly, rebuild themselves into something functional, if not fully healed, when both parties are finally willing to do the honest work required. I have been careful throughout this story not to dwell too long on Vivian, partly because I made a deliberate choice, years ago, to stop carrying the weight of her particular reckoning, and partly because I think there is something important in modeling, for the women watching this, what it actually looks like to let go of a grudge you are fully entitled to keep. What I can tell you, because it eventually became a matter of public record through the embezzlement settlement, is that Vivian's financial situation changed dramatically over those 3 years. The Ridgeline Strategic Partners arrangement, once flagged by the anonymous documents I'd sent to the company's auditors, unraveled into a settlement that required her to repay a significant portion of the diverted funds and relinquish her remaining financial interest in Callahan Biosciences entirely. She and Walter, according to what Adam has told me, separated quietly about 18 months ago, not over any single dramatic event, but over the slow, accumulating weight of a marriage that had, much like my own once had, been organized around performance rather than genuine partnership for far longer than either of them had been willing to admit. I do not take satisfaction in Vivian's difficulties, though I understand if some of you, listening to this story, might feel she deserved every bit of what eventually came for her. What I feel, mostly, when I think about Vivian now, is a kind of distant, complicated sympathy. The recognition that she, too, had spent decades inside a family system that rewarded appearance over substance, control over honesty, and that whatever cruelty she directed at me over the years was, in its own twisted way, a reflection of the same forces that had once tried to make me smaller than I actually was. I have not spoken to Vivian since the divorce was finalized, and I don't expect that to change. But I have made my peace, as much as I am able, with the fact that her story, like everyone else's in this saga, continues to unfold on its own timeline, shaped by choices that were never mine to control and consequences that were never mine to deliver. I simply stopped standing between her and the truth of what she had done. The rest, in the end, was never actually my responsibility to manage. I mentioned Theo earlier, and I want to close this story properly by telling you what has happened since that first dinner at the warehouse, because I think the women watching this deserve to know that a story about betrayal and rebuilding can, eventually, also become a story about genuine, unguarded love, the kind that arrives not as a rescue, but as a quiet, welcome addition to a life already whole on its own. Theo proposed this past autumn on an ordinary Sunday evening in the garden behind the house with the black shutters, among the hydrangeas I had planted with my own hands more than a decade earlier, back when I still believed my worth was measured by how much I could quietly provide for other people without ever asking for anything in return. "I want to be clear about something," he said, kneeling in the grass, holding a small box he'd clearly been carrying around for longer than I realized. "I am not proposing because I think you need rescuing, or completing, or fixing. I've watched you build an extraordinary company, raise two extraordinary children, and rebuild an entire life from the wreckage of a marriage that tried to convince you that you were replaceable. I am proposing because I would like the enormous privilege of getting to stand beside all of that for the rest of my life, not because you need me there, but because I would genuinely, deeply love to be there." I said yes, of course, in the golden evening light of a garden I had built for a different family, in a different chapter of my life. And I thought, standing there, about the particular grace of a love that arrives after you have already done the hardest work of learning your own worth. A love that asks nothing of you except to keep being exactly who you have already, painstakingly, become. We are planning a small wedding for next spring, nothing like the elaborate ceremony my mother once planned for my brother Danny, nothing like the grand, performative celebration Preston's family once staged for our own wedding 22 years earlier. Just family, real family, the kind built through choice and loyalty rather than obligation. Sophie and Adam, my mother and Danny, Priya and Marcus and the growing team at Hale Diagnostics, Theo's own children, all of us gathered together in the garden behind a house with black shutters, celebrating not the end of a long, difficult story, but the beginning of whatever comes after it. If you have stayed with me through this entire story, thank you. I know it has been long, longer than most, but I have come to believe, over these past 3 years, that some truths simply cannot be rushed into a tidy 10-minute resolution, and I did not want to shortchange any of you by pretending my healing happened faster, or more simply, than it actually did. I want to leave you with this. Revenge, real revenge, the kind that actually changes something, is rarely loud. It rarely looks like the dramatic confrontations we imagine when we are lying awake at night, rehearsing all the things we wish we'd said to the people who wronged us. Real revenge, in my experience, looks like patience. It looks like documentation. It looks like quietly, methodically protecting what is yours, long before anyone asks you to prove you deserve it. And then simply, calmly, letting the truth of your own worth stand on its own, undefended, unapologetic, until the people who once dismissed you have no choice but to finally, belatedly, see you clearly. You do not need anger to reclaim your life. You need patience and self-respect, and the quiet, stubborn conviction that what you have built with your own hands belongs to you, regardless of whose name ends up on the plaque, or the door, or the boardroom seating chart. I built an entire company, a new marriage, a repaired relationship with my mother, and a version of myself I am, for the first time in my adult life, genuinely proud of, not by burning down everything around me in a blaze of righteous fury, but by simply, patiently, refusing to disappear any longer. Wherever you are in your own story tonight, I hope you find that same quiet, unshakable resolve. And I hope, when your own reckoning finally arrives, however it arrives, you meet it not with rage, but with the calm, settled dignity of a woman who has always known exactly what she is worth, and has simply, finally, decided the whole world deserves to know it too. There is one more thing I want to share before I close this story completely, something I have never told Priscilla Woodard, never told the audience at that Boston conference, never even fully told Renata, though I suspect she has always known it was there. In the weeks after the boardroom meeting, before I had built anything, before the license lapsed, before any of the reckoning had begun to take its visible shape, I wrote a letter to Walter Callahan that I never sent. I still have it, folded into a drawer in my office desk, and I want to read you a piece of it now, because I think it captures something about that early, uncertain period that none of the later, more triumphant chapters of this story ever fully conveyed. Walter, I wrote, on a night when I could not sleep, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a cup of tea long gone cold, I do not know, tonight, whether any of what I am planning will actually work. I do not know if the license structure will hold up under scrutiny, or if Meridian's lawyers will find some way around it, or if I am about to lose not just my marriage and my career, but also, somehow, my own sense of who I am, chasing a vindication that may never actually arrive. I am 46 years old, and I am starting over from nothing, and some nights, the fear of that feels larger than any anger I have ever felt toward you, or Preston, or Blair, or Vivian. I do not know if I am being brave or simply reckless. I only know that I cannot keep making myself smaller, and that whatever comes next, however frightening, has to be better than 14 more years of the same quiet erasure. I never sent that letter, because I understood, even as I wrote it, that it was not really meant for Walter at all. It was meant for me, a way of putting into words, honestly, without performance, exactly how frightened and uncertain I actually was during the period everyone else, looking back now, describes as my moment of quiet, confident triumph. I want you to know that the confidence came later. In the beginning, there was mostly just fear, and a stubborn, trembling refusal to let the fear win. I think it's important to tell you this, because I worry, sometimes, that stories like mine, told from the vantage point of eventual success, can accidentally suggest that courage feels like certainty, that the right choice always announces itself clearly, that the woman making the brave decision always knows, in the moment, that she is making the right one. That was never my experience. My experience was closer to walking through a dark room with my hands out in front of me, trusting a structure I had built 14 years earlier without any real evidence that trusting it would actually work, simply because the alternative, staying exactly where I was, exactly as small as they wanted me to remain, had finally, after 14 years, become impossible to bear. If I could go back and speak to the version of myself who sat in that conference room in 2004, 27 years old, answering Walter Callahan's questions about her 5-year plan, while he really meant to ask about children, I think I know exactly what I would tell her. I would tell her that her talent is not something she needs to apologize for, or soften, or quietly hand over to other people in exchange for their approval. I would tell her that being generous with her work does not require being invisible about her ownership of it, that she is allowed to build extraordinary things and also insist, clearly and without guilt, on being credited for having built them. I would tell her that the family she is about to marry into will, for many years, mistake her quiet competence for a lack of ambition, and that this mistake will cost her more than she can currently imagine, and that she should, from the very first year, keep her own records, protect her own paperwork, And never, under any circumstances, assume that love and fairness are automatically the same thing inside a family business. I would tell her that the years spent believing usefulness would eventually be rewarded with recognition were not entirely wasted. She built something genuinely extraordinary during those years, work that would eventually change how a dozen serious conditions are diagnosed in their earliest, most treatable stages, work that mattered regardless of whose name appeared first on the plaque. But I would also tell her, gently, that she does not need to wait 14 years to learn the lesson it eventually took her 14 years to learn. She is allowed to ask for credit now. She is allowed to protect her own worth now. She does not need a boardroom betrayal, a collapsed marriage, and a 22-year wait to finally understand that she was always, from the very beginning, worth more than the quiet, convenient role everyone around her was so eager to assign her. I do not know if that 27-year-old version of myself, hopeful and inexperienced, and so eager to be liked by a powerful family, would have believed me. I suspect she would have nodded politely and gone right on making herself smaller, the way I did for so many years, because some lessons I have come to understand can only be learned through the long, difficult, unglamorous work of actually living them. But I hope, if any of you watching tonight are standing where she once stood, at the beginning of a marriage or a career or a family business that asks you to be quietly, endlessly useful in exchange for a love and respect that never quite fully arrives, that my story reaches you a little earlier than mine reached me. I hope you do not need 14 years, or 19 years, or a $2.4 billion collapse to understand what I am telling you now. You are allowed to be seen. You are allowed to be credited. You are allowed at any age, in any chapter, to stop making yourself smaller for people who were never actually going to notice the sacrifice, and start building instead a life that finally, fully belongs to you. There is a small ritual I have kept every year on the anniversary of that boardroom meeting that I have not mentioned until now because it felt, for a long time, too private to share. Every year, on that date, I drive out to the warehouse, the old one, the converted brewery, which Hale Diagnostics has long since outgrown, but which I still lease, quietly, for storage, unable to fully let it go. And I sit alone for an hour among the old second-hand equipment I bought at auction during the very first weeks of building something new. I bring a cup of coffee. I do not bring my phone. I simply sit, in the particular silence of a place that once held nothing but my fear and my stubbornness, and a handful of boxes marked fragile, and I remind myself, deliberately, of exactly how far that fear and that stubbornness eventually carried me. This year, my last visit before recording this, I brought Sophie with me, home for the summer between semesters of her doctoral program, and we sat together on two overturned crates, the same kind Adam once sat on the day he found me unpacking a secondhand centrifuge in our garage, and she asked me a question I hadn't fully considered before. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if the license structure hadn't held up? If some technicality had unraveled the whole thing, and you'd lost the company, lost the case, ended up with nothing? I thought about that question carefully, because I think it deserves an honest answer, not a triumphant one. I think, I told her, I still would have built something, maybe smaller, maybe slower. Maybe it would have taken me longer to find my footing, without the leverage of the patents behind me. But I don't think I would have gone back to being small again, Sophie. I think that decision, the decision to stop making myself invisible, was already made in my heart, long before I knew whether the legal structure would hold. The patents gave me leverage. They didn't give me courage. I think I'd already found that on my own, sitting at my kitchen table long before any lawyer confirmed I had a case worth fighting. Sophie was quiet for a moment, turning that over. I think that's the part of your story I want to remember most, she said finally. Not the $2.4 billion deal, or the headlines, or even the company. Just you, at the kitchen table, deciding to stop being small before you had any proof it would work out. I think she is right. And so, if there is one final thing I want to leave you with tonight, beyond everything else I have already shared, it is this. The proof always comes later. The courage has to come first. Wherever you are tonight, whatever quiet, private reckoning you are still working up the strength to begin, I hope you find that courage before the proof arrives, the way I eventually did, sitting alone at my kitchen table, staring at 2 words on a blank screen, finally ready to build something entirely, unapologetically my own. I get a lot of messages, in the comments of stories like this one, asking practical questions about the mechanics of what I did. And I want to spend a little time answering them honestly, because I think the details matter more than the drama, and I would rather leave you with something useful than simply something satisfying to watch. People often ask why I didn't simply demand a raise, or a promotion, or a formal ownership stake, at some point during those 14 years, instead of waiting for a crisis to force the issue. I understand the question, and I want to answer it honestly. I tried, twice, in smaller ways, early in my career at Callahan Biosciences. The first time, in year 4, I asked Walter directly for a title change that would have reflected my actual role in the science division, rather than the more junior title I had been given at hiring. He told me, kindly but firmly, that titles at Callahan Biosciences were earned through tenure, not enthusiasm, and that I should be patient. I was patient. The second time, in year 9, I asked, more formally, in a written proposal, for a small equity stake in the company, reflecting the value of the Velostat patents I had already developed by that point. Walter took the proposal to the board and it was rejected, quietly, without much explanation, and Preston, my own husband, advised me privately not to push the issue further because it was putting unnecessary strain on the family. I want to be honest. After those 2 attempts, I stopped asking directly, not because I lost my nerve entirely, but because I made a calculated, if ultimately costly, decision to protect what I could protect quietly, through the licensing structure Renata helped me build, rather than continuing to ask openly for something I had already learned, twice, would not be freely given. I do not think that decision was cowardly. I think it was, in its own way, strategic. A recognition that some doors, once you have knocked on them clearly and been turned away, are better left alone until you have the leverage to open them on your own terms. But I also understand, looking back, that this strategy came at a real cost. 9 more years of underpayment, 9 more years of undercredited work, 9 more years of quietly accepting a role smaller than the one I had actually earned. People also ask whether I regret not confronting the family more directly, more publicly, in the moment of the boardroom betrayal itself, rather than waiting patiently for the license to lapse on its own. I understand this question too, and my honest answer is, no, I do not regret the patience, though I understand why it might look, from the outside, like passivity rather than strategy. A public confrontation in that boardroom, on that day, would have cost me everything and gained me nothing. I had no proof yet, no leverage yet, only my own certainty, which, as I had already learned twice by that point in my career, was never quite enough on its own to move people who had already decided my role in their company was purely functional rather than foundational. The patience was not passivity. It was the deliberate, disciplined work of waiting until the truth could no longer be dismissed, ignored, or explained away. waiting until the facts themselves, rather than my own testimony about the facts, became the thing doing the arguing. I know patience is not a satisfying answer in a world that often rewards loud, immediate confrontation as the truest measure of strength. But I want to tell every woman watching this who is currently weighing the same choice: speak up now, at real cost, or wait and build leverage first. That both paths are valid, and that neither one makes you weaker or braver than the other. What matters, I have come to believe, is not the volume of your response, but the integrity of it. Whether you are moving, in whatever form that movement takes, toward a life that finally, honestly reflects your actual worth, rather than continuing to accept a smaller one simply because it feels safer, or more familiar, or less likely to disturb the people around you. I want to end, finally, with a small, ordinary image, because I think it says more than any of the larger, more dramatic moments I've already shared. Most mornings now, I stand in front of the bathroom mirror in the house with the black shutters, getting ready for a day that belongs entirely to work I chose, surrounded by people who genuinely want me there, building a company whose name I picked myself, in a font I picked myself, and I catch my own reflection in a way I rarely allowed myself to during those 14 quiet, undercredited years. I look, really look, at the woman standing there. The lines around her eyes that weren't there at 27. The steadiness in her shoulders that took decades to earn. The particular, hard-won calm in her expression that no boardroom, no husband, no mother-in-law, no headline ever managed to fully take from her, even in the worst of it. I do not always love everything I see in that mirror. There are mornings when the grief still surfaces, unbidden, for the marriage I once believed would last a lifetime, for the version of my own mother who spent decades unable to see me clearly, for the 14 years I spent making myself smaller than I ever needed to be. Healing, I have learned, is not a permanent arrival at peace. It is a practice, repeated daily, sometimes gracefully and sometimes clumsily, of choosing, again and again, to see yourself honestly and to keep building, regardless of how you feel on any particular morning. But most days, when I look in that mirror now, I recognize, finally and completely, a woman who knows exactly what she is worth. Not because a boardroom finally validated her. Not because a headline finally named her. Not because a $2.4 billion deal finally collapsed under the weight of her own quiet, patient leverage. I recognize her because she decided, one ordinary Wednesday night at a kitchen table, staring at a blank document, that she was done waiting for anyone else's permission to matter. That is the woman I hope you carry with you when this story ends tonight. Not the scientist, not the founder, not the headline. Just a woman, standing in front of her own mirror, finally, fully seeing herself. I hope you find her too, whenever you're ready. She has been there, inside you, the whole time, quietly waiting for you to stop apologizing for taking up space and start building the life that was always, rightfully, yours to claim. Thank you for listening truly to every part of this long, honest story. I'll see you in the next one. If any part of tonight's story felt like your own life, I hope you'll remember that patience is not the same thing as surrender, and that quiet does not mean weak. Take care of yourselves this week, protect what belongs to you, document what you build, and trust that the woman who waited 14 years to be seen is still, somehow, standing here today, whole. I'll be back soon with another story.